Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Southern New England Southern Pine Beetle Update and Forest Management Meeting. I'm Polly Wiegand. I am the Fire Project Specialist for the Forest Stewards Guild and the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. The North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange is hosting this meeting as part of our Southern Pine Beetle Working Group that was formed upwards of 7 to 8 years ago and was an outgrowth of the collaboration and work that had been advancing in New York, related, especially in the Long Island area, related to the Southern Pine Beetle outbreaks that then have spread north, despite our best efforts to try to contain and suppress the beetle. So, um, as a Long Islander, I live on Hampton Bays on Long Island. I do apologize that we have shared our little yet mighty pest to the north, but we are here today to give an update on its current distribution and activity, as well as the advancing science and management activities that have been occurring over the last year. Um, we have some great speakers as part of our members of our working group and members of our greater community in the Northeast that are joining us today. So let me roll through our agenda quickly. So the morning, we're going to kick off discussions of updates as far as Southern Pine Beetle distribution across the region and its activity and management response by each state. From New York through Massachusetts. We'll take a 15-minute break after questions, and then we'll start up again for the final hour and a half of the program with more comprehensive information and presentations on Southern Pine Beetle management and response. We will, at 12 o'clock, we expect to be wrapped up with the formal presentations, and we will have the opportunity and open it up for questions. So as we go along, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And depending on the number of questions, we will either open it up to folks to ask those questions directly, or we will be working also to put out the questions to our speakers to respond to that. So we hope to wrap up at 12:30 is the goal, depending on, we'll be wrapping up at 12:30 with the program itself. We'll be wrapping up with the presentations at 12, so half an hour for questions. So as part of the information and outreach that we had provided, you should have been provided, along with the agenda, these information on different resources related to Southern Pine Beetle management. The top section under NAFC is the cache of where all the previous presentations and information that has been distributed or provided through NAFC and the Southern Pine Beetle Working Group can be found through that active link, and we will put them into the chat as well. And then there's some other resources related to Southern Pine Beetle natural history, its range expansion in the Northeast, and its impact, as well as the advancing research. So the hazard rating and the forest response related to Southern Pine Beetle, and then information on prevention for Southern Pine Beetle if it has not yet arrived in your area, on different activities that you can advance. So I wanted to take a moment as we start the program just to recognize all the different partners that have participated in putting together this program and making it available for free to all. It is being recorded and will be available after our presentation and event closes, and will be made available on our website, on the NAFC website, as well as we will email it out to all the attendees that had registered for the event, and there'll be a posting in our newsletter. So, but a special nod to Kevin Dodds. He's the regional entomologist with the Forest Service up in Durham, New Hampshire, and he has been integral in leading us all and putting all of the land managers and entomologists in touch and providing the resources to help manage Southern Pine Beetle, including bringing up and connecting us with those from the Forest Service that have dedicated their life to researching this little insect. So Kevin has been integral in his leadership with the Forest Service in helping us all collectively address Southern Pine Beetle and monitor it. So today we have are going to kick off with the Southern Pine Beetle distribution. Kevin will kick it off with giving us an overall regional update. Jessica Cancelleri from DEC Lands and Forests in the Forest Health Unit out of New York will move into the spot after Kevin, and then we'll move across the landscape from west to east, hitting Connecticut with Claire Rutledge, who's the entomologist with the Department of Entomology, with the Connecticut Agricultural Experimental Station, then move to Alana Russell and Lisa Tweaksbury, both who are actively participating in Southern Pine Beetle management and monitoring out of Rhode Island, out of the URI Biocontrol Lab, and also the Department of Environmental Management. And then we'll wrap up this section with Nicole Keller, who has big congratulations to Nicole. She has just recently been appointed, and this is her first week, starting as the Habitat Restoration and Program Manager with Mass Wildlife. She previously worked with DCR and doing forest health monitoring and management in Massachusetts. So she's moved into a different division, into Mass Wildlife there in Massachusetts. So with that, I thank all of our presenters and affiliates, and I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Great, thanks so much, Polly. Let's see, share here. That should be up for everybody, I hope. So what I thought I would do with the time this morning is just give a really brief overview of the distribution. Not a lot has changed in 10 years. In terms of infestation, we've captured some beetles further north, but really the distribution stayed pretty solid. And then for the second part, a lot of folks on here, we have a really good community of colleagues that work on Southern Pine Beetle, and there's been a lot of collaboration to test some new lures that we have, and I thought I'd throw up some preliminary data that we received from our cooperators down south, just to update on some potential lure changes. So this is a map. I think I made this in like 2017, maybe, after the first 2 years of survey, and of course these are just trap detections. There's nothing on here about infested trees, and pretty early on we had a good sense of where the population was. Obviously, Long Island was hit harder, and we had a lot of trap catches. Connecticut, Claire's work in Connecticut. She started detecting beetles, not just in traps, but also had some infestations there. Lisa, and then later when Alana and John Mitchell joined the effort in Rhode Island, we've kind of always had catches in traps in Rhode Island, but no infestations yet. And then Massachusetts kind of was the same thing, since 2017, especially, we started getting some of those, I'm sorry, 2016, we started getting some of those more northern captures. And Massachusetts has trapped, pretty much straight since then, tracking, the potential movement north. And I'm not going to say too much more about that because we've got Nicole to cover a lot of their efforts coming up at the end of this session. But so this was our, kind of our footprint that we were working off of for, I think, probably 4 years. There was no real, big differences occurring or changes occurring. In 2021, I think it was, we saw this kind of expansion into traps anyways, and you can see the black dots here are positive traps. And in New York, there was some expansion north with positive trap catches north of Albany. We had Carolyn Kanaski, a PhD student at UNH at the time, had traps in and around Ossipee and the Waterboro Pine Barrens and had captures there as well. And so really all of a sudden it seemed like, wow, what's going on? We've got these catches much further north than we expected at the time. And I think it was Jess and maybe some other people too were started to talk about, that we had some pretty mild winters the 2 years before that. And so the thought was that maybe this allowed the beetles to expand a little bit. But then we got hit by pretty severe winter temperatures for, I think, 2 years in a row. And we really haven't seen much activity, even in these traps up here. I think, I was working with Tom Schmelk in Maine last year on the detection project. And I think we just got one Southern Pine Beetle here. And I think that's been kind of the story across, even in New York, where the numbers were relatively high at first, but they've dropped back each year. And so we've had these little cold snaps where we've gotten into -10, -12, -15 degrees Fahrenheit, which has really knocked the beetles back, I think. So this is sort of where we're at now, right? So no infestations or anything like that, infested trees in any of the quote unquote expanded range. So that's good news. So I'm gonna show some preliminary information because we are getting close to the time where people might be putting out traps. And again, this project, it really wouldn't have happened without all of the help from everybody in New England, really, and the states that we work with pitching in and running these experiments. And they're not really like fun experiments to run either because you have to rotate the traps. They're kind of a pain, but we've all been doing that. The project was a STDP funded to University of Georgia, Kamal Gandhi's lab, and then Brian Sullivan, who is with Southern Research Station. So he's a Forest Service person in research down there. Some of you have probably interacted with him at some point. He's been up here to give a talk, or maybe talks, I can't remember. But anyways, we wanted to really the goal. So we have a really good lure, right? And it was developed for monitoring, but we wanted to try to optimize that for detection so that we could put the most powerful lure out in these areas, sort of on the margins or on the margins of the range, and give us the best chance to detect something early. So Brian and Kamal had some idea that a couple of different tweaks could be beneficial. The first was the addition of 4AA, which oddly had been seen as an anti-attractant at one point. And then they also had some information that adding increasing the endobrevicomin release rate would increase catches. And so we already have endobrevicomin in the lure, but 4AA would be is a new addition. And so we tested those two, the standard against the standard plus 4AA, and then the standard plus increased endobrevicomin at 3 times the rate and 4AA. And so this is all preliminary, and Brian hasn't even run statistics on it yet. It's going to be difficult to run stats on some of these because of the low catches, and that's kind of the problem, especially when you want to test a detection lure. We ran it in areas where we knew we would catch beetles, but we also pushed it north where we weren't sure that we would find any beetles or not. And there were some negative sites, and that's actually the little yellow pins there. It's just cut out, the key is cut out at the top. So you can see the blue. So parts of the pie chart here, blue is the standard lure of what we've been using for pretty much since the beginning. The orange is the standard plus 4AA, and then the green part of the pie is the standard release rate plus increased endo and 4AA. And it's dangerous to draw too much from this right now, but I think what is interesting is that there does seem to be a fairly consistent pattern across the region, with the standard lure normally being outperformed by the orange and the green parts of that. So the two other modified lures. So Um, again, we've got to do some more work on this, but it looks promising, that at least adding 4AA could increase the catches, and hopefully that would translate into a more powerful detection tool too. But that still needs to be tested. And so, moving into this year, I'm hoping Brian will, be able to run some stats and get us some better analysis of the data. But moving into this year, I think certainly adding 4AA appears to be beneficial. Polly ran some of these on Long Island, and nobody's ever seen trap catches like what was found there, and that was with the 4AA. So, tens of thousands of beetles over a 2-week period in a trap, and that's unheard of up here. We do need to do an additional test that was planned for this fall, but it's all been shelved right now because we don't know, we're having problems purchasing and doing some other things. So we're not sure that we're going to be able to get this out. My guess is probably not, but we wanted to do a 1-to-1, the 4AA enhanced lure versus the standard lure. And then so for future surveys, I think, where I'm heading with this anyways would be, for monitoring. So an area where you have Southern Pine Beetle, but you just want to kind of track things, just stick with that current 3 component. There's no reason to bring in more beetles that you have to then count. But on those margins and in those areas that we don't have the beetle, I think, I would add 4AA at this point because we didn't see any injury to trap catches by putting 4AA on. So there's no reduction or anything like that. And it looks like there's a legitimate pattern there. And then, sticking with fall surveys, I think this is something, I think Claire saw this her first or second year trapping, that there was a peak in the fall that really wasn't defined in the Southeast before. Lisa and Alana and John have trapped Rhode Island throughout the grow season. Same with the New Yorkers, and that pattern really holds where, and it's very significant. I mean, the amount of beetles that are flying, or I should say that are captured in the fall, really, sometimes it's 20-30 fold what we get in the early parts of the spring, and early parts of the summer. So that's it for me. And so Jess, let me stop sharing, and Jess is going to come on and talk about New York.
Okay. Okay. Let me just go back one. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you see everything?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, thanks. Oh, one moment. I just lost this thing. Um, Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry. It like minimized. Here we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jess Cancelleri. I'm the Forest Health Coordinator here in New York. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about our management of Southern Pine Beetle on Long Island later. So right now I'm just going to focus on the current distribution in New York, and then talk a little bit about what's going on upstate compared to Long Island. So Kevin already showed the regional map with all the trap detections. And so the map you're seeing here kind of represents those trap detections in New York and sort of the time series that they all occurred in. The exception, of course, is Long Island, where you see the red circle. And the red just means that that is where we have active infestations of Southern Pine Beetle, and that's the only place in the state that we currently have active infestations. And with the exception of like a couple tiny little outbreaks here and there, that has been the case since 2014 when it was first detected in the state. So we've been monitoring pitch pine sites and other hard pine sites across the state since about 2015. And through the lower Hudson Valley, it started in the lower Hudson Valley and then subsequently moved up through the mid Hudson Valley. We've seen this pretty consistent northward progression of positive trap detections over the years. And so, still to this day, it's remained beetles and traps and not associated with infested trees. And as Kevin said, we think temperature has played a big role in that. We seem to see a more rapid expansion, or we'll find it at more sites, when we've had a lack of those minimum winter temperatures that we need. But it's been kind of interesting because on Long Island, the photo in the bottom right shows the Central Pine Barrens Preserve on Long Island, which again we're going to talk about later. And there's contiguous pitch pine there, so it makes sense why you would have infestations of southern pine beetle. As we move upstate, the host becomes a lot more scarce. We do have some red pine. We have inland pitch pine barrens, as well as like sandstone pavement barrens way up in northeastern New York. We have the Rome sand plains in sort of northern central New York. So we have sort of systems throughout the state of these susceptible hosts. But it's interesting because when you go to these sites, the pitch pine component is so sparse. And so if you look up at the picture in the upper right, those are some of our techs standing on top of Scunamunk Mountain, which is like dwarf pitch pine. You can see how it's shorter than Jordan that's standing there. And so this particular stand, you have some dwarf pitch pine at the top, and then it kind of fades into some mature pitch pine for like in a very small area. And then it immediately converts to hardwoods. So this is a site where we get some of the highest trap counts of southern pine beetle in the state. So it's just kind of mind boggling. We don't find it. We don't find galleries. We don't find pitch tubes. We've looked everywhere. So, there's not that much known about how southern pine beetle behaves at low levels. And we're experiencing that in real time every day. So let's see. Some interesting things have come out of the upstate trapping work that we're trying to take a closer look at in the coming years. And so we noticed that depending on what site we were trapping at, the trap numbers looked very different. And our entomologist Liam started also monitoring all the predators and associates of southern pine beetle, the major competitors. So we've been kind of looking at those communities over time. And we noticed that at a site like Scunamunk that is unmanaged, I wouldn't say necessarily degraded, but unmanaged, plenty of invasive species, probably some recreational stress, things like that. We get these really high numbers of southern pine beetle, which you can see in red in the figures. And then you go to a site like the Albany Pine Bush that is actively managed, lots of prescribed fire, lots of thinning, and we see really low numbers of southern pine beetle and very high numbers of the predators. And I think I might have said, I'm trying to look at this. Never mind. I'm sorry, guys. I said that the SPB was red in the last figure, but it was actually blue. So SPB is blue at Scunamunk, and you can see how we get these peaks every fall where we get high numbers. And I think that particular year it was only 200 and something, but trap counts go up to 1,000, 1,500 beetles sometimes. But Albany Pine Bush, if you look at the red, that is all the predators, primarily I think the clarid beetles, which are, the primary predator of southern pine beetles. So massive amounts of predators. And the southern pine beetle numbers have been maintained at very low levels since we detected it at the pine bush in 2018. We get maybe 3 beetles in a trap, 6 beetles in a trap. So we're really interested in that difference. And, we are always talking about how forest management is good for southern pine beetle management. And there's lots of other data to show that, but we want to start being able to show it in our trap catches and looking at how good forest management can suppress southern pine beetle numbers over time. So this work is continuing. The original purpose of this work was not to look at forest management and southern pine beetle. It was to simply try to capture the phenology of what was going on upstate, which I'm still not quite sure we've done. I mean, On Long Island, the beetle comes out in May pretty consistently, and it's similar to the South. Upstate for a while, we were seeing no trap catches until July or August, and we didn't really understand that. We didn't know if it was just random. Traps are essentially a needle in a haystack, or if there was something else going on. We eventually did catch beetles in May, but we thought perhaps there's just so much, like if you look at a site like the Pine Bush, perhaps there's just so much predator pressure or something that it's exerting pressure on Southern Pine Beetle and we're just not capturing the beetles. So we're still trying to figure all that out, but it's a good example of how a project with one objective reveals information and then it becomes a new project. And so I'm not going to really get into our management. Like I said, I'm going to talk about that later. So at this point, I'll pass it on to Claire. Stop sharing.
Hey. Well, I assume other people are out there. It's always kind of weird talking into the void. So I'm seeing a lot of parallels in Connecticut to what they're seeing in upstate New York. We have a lot of the very similar distribution, but I just wanted to tell the story of what we've seen in Connecticut. It's been very undramatic, I guess, over the years, but it is showing a lot of the same patterns. Before I start, I just want to thank lots and lots of people, especially in DEEP, our Department of Environmental Protection, especially the foresters who know the state like the back of their hand and were able to help find all the various stands of pitch pine for us, as well as some of the land trust folks. Lots of people have worked with this over the years. This is just our original foray into the situation. Back in 2015, we first thought to look for this after hearing about Long Island, and we found it in spring of 2015, approximately 5 minutes after we asked the state foresters if they'd ever seen anything like this. And this is that first summer we really went all over the state, and we did see many, many infested trees. We saw a lot of Norway spruce, a lot of pitch pine, but also red pine, Scots pine, and even a couple of sad little white pines. And so we were pretty braced, but since then, and we started trapping, and in 2015, 2016, I was really concentrating on trying a north-south gradient to see what we would get. And then in subsequent years, we sort of expanded east. And we've done different schedules over the year. In 2016, we just did the first 6 weeks, but otherwise we've been going through the season. And really starting in around 2017, we started focusing on those pitch pine sites. And that's continued. Since then, we've added some sites to the west. So we've sort of gone all over the state with this. So like both Jess was saying and Kevin was saying, we are definitely seeing, you know, that big peak at the end of the season is really big, although we do see fairly consistently some little peaks in June and July. I don't know if these represent different generations or not, but this is a pretty consistent pattern. This is just one of our sites over a few years to try to give you some of the picture of what we see with the seasonality. This is showing 8 of our sites, and we did the sites, I'm calling them the western sites. They're the ones in orange. And you can see that the concentration has really been sort of in the eastern part of the state, and we are starting to get much larger numbers, or we're starting to get much larger numbers building up to 2021. And this is very consistent with what Kevin and Jess were saying. And then it seems to have been knocked back in 22 and really gone right back down. At the peak, one of our sites, we got over 4,000 beetles, and the bulk of that was in that fall season, with 1 week at 1,200. So we're consistently finding them, even in years where it looks very small. We're consistently finding them at all of these sites, but at very low levels. And along with that, we just are not finding the beetles. The beetles, except for in the traps, so no trees. And we just haven't found infested trees. There's been a couple of trees where we've seen some pops. There's a couple of Scots pines and a red pine that we saw the pitch tubes on. And we had our collaborators cut the trees down, and then we peeled, and they were unsuccessful attacks. The pitch tubes had done their jobs. The trees themselves were very healthy. But other than that, that's really just what we've seen. We have not seen this sort of epidemic thing in any part of the state. And why are we protected from this? I mean, part of it, I think, has to be the temperature, the change in plant hardiness. We're getting warmer and warmer, just like everyone else is. And you can see, especially at all of our various sites across the state, things were very warm up through that 2021 winter, and then we had a real shock in that winter. So maybe that's what knocked them back. But we have the last couple of winters, again, not had that cold of a temperature. So maybe they'll start building up again. I don't know. So, I mean, a lot of what I think protects our poor pitch pine in Connecticut is this temperature compared to what they see down in Long Island. However, and this is just showing those temperatures again, and the red line represents the death line at -20, and you can see that we don't really go down there very often in a lot of our sites. The other thing is what Jess was just talking about in terms of the sort of scantiness. We have sort of two different places where pitch pine is left in Connecticut because of fire suppression, changes in habitat and landscape use and development. Pitch pine is really only in about 5% of the areas that it used to be in the state. And the map of Connecticut there, you see all those little sad dark dots. There are more pitch pine than that. That's just state lands. But in general, that is pitch pine. And we have the low-lying sandy places, and then we have those up top on the ridge, so the barrens and the ridges. And the barrens are almost all gone. They're very small. Our big areas are like 10 acres, and there's only a few of them. And DEEP has been working on keeping them pine barrens by either selective logging or burning or both. But those sites, we've been looking at them this summer from sort of forestry point of view. Those are coming back as hardwood forests, and the new pitch pine seedlings that had happened right after the management actions are not coming back. So we have a really, compared to what's happening down in Long Island, much more similar to upstate New York scattered landscape, and that might also be contributing to our lack of buildup and outbreaks. So really, that's just the story. I mean, I'm interested to see Jessica's work with the predators. We're also seeing some interesting thing with predators, but it's not really related to management per se. But the lowland areas have a lot more other bark beetles, and a lot more predators than the areas that we've been trapping that are up on top of ridges. So that's something I'm curious about as a dynamic. But there's a lot of things to go from there. But I think that's really about all I have to say now, and I think we can move on to um, Rhode Island and hear what they've been seeing. And I'll be happy to answer any questions in chat.
Okay, thanks, Alana. So yes, myself, Alana Russell, and John Mitchell have been doing most of this monitoring for Southern Pine Beetle more recently. Next slide. And just a quick review that I first became aware of Southern Pine Beetle when it was on Long Island. And I went to a meeting there. I was very interested, and then kind of went back and heard about the history of it. And so the next thing, next slide, is, our trees next. And so in Rhode Island, we did want to do something about it. So next slide, Alana. I was contacted by someone who actually had been working on Southern Pine Beetle with Matt Ayers up in New Hampshire, saying that, hey, Connecticut found some Southern Pine Beetle infestations in March of 2015 is when I heard. And so we contacted Kevin Dodds right away, and we got it set up to monitor that in May. And so in the beginning, I was still, not all that aware of Southern Pine Beetle. But we followed Kevin's instructions. We were able to receive lures from him. We set up traps in, I think at the time we were doing white pine, pitch pine, and some Norway spruce. And there's a little bit of outreach we did so that people would let us know, so that they'd know what the damage looked like. We used some land trusts, some like Nature Conservancy property, quite a bit of state property for this. And again, we were kind of doing just the 6 weeks in the spring, doing that monitoring in the beginning. Next slide. And so Alana was able to pull up this map years ago to give us a bit of an idea. The blue areas are where we have our pines. I think one area might still be called the Pine Barren, but it's a small state, and our pitch pine areas, I should say, are pretty small as well. So the orange dots there are where most of our traps are. Over the years, we did change a little bit. We realized that we weren't finding them in white pine very much. We tried to really focus on the pitch pine. And so in the beginning, it was myself and Alana from URI and Paul Ricard from DEM. Now Alana Russell is with DEM, and John Mitchell from the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. I got involved out on Prudence Island. That's what those two orange spots are. They look like they're in the water, but they're just on Prudence Island. Okay, next slide. So again, I was new to this insect. So the first time I went out, I saw a lot of this. And so I sent these pictures to Kevin right away and was told, no, this is not Southern Pine Beetle, but it is black turpentine beetle. And we actually were losing trees. They were falling down in the areas that I was surveying. So next slide. So along with counting our Southern Pine Beetle, we did keep track of our black turpentine beetle numbers, and they were really high. Red turpentine beetle as well. Over the years, they've gone down a little bit, and then I'm kind of interested that we jump back up. But I did hear that the history in Rhode Island is that the black turpentine beetle seemed to take out most of our Japanese black pines in our coastal areas before this time. Okay, next slide. So we did start in 2015. There are a few things that changed along the way, but what both Jessica and Claire said, it really goes for Rhode Island as well. We have had low numbers most of the time, but consistently year after year finding some. Certain places, generally the ones with a higher percentage of pitch pine, had higher numbers. And so with some of those, we have gone to doing more than the 6 weeks now. We're going into the fall and getting some higher peaks. We've had some help from URI. Chuck Labash is on this meeting from URI, who has done some drone flights. Matt Ayers actually came down with a postdoc, or his postdoc came down, and I guess he came later, really looking, helping us try to look for red tops, trying to find any infestation that might be in these areas where the higher numbers were. And we did one day find one Southern Pine Beetle in one tree in an area that had been positive. But other than that, we're pretty much in the same situation. Luckily, no real infestations, but seeing numbers increasing, we are happy to work with Kevin, and we're happy for all our collaborators in Rhode Island to help us, think about if some management is necessary. Next slide. And so this is just to tie in again that New England is seeing the Southern Pine Beetle, and we are interested in, managing it as necessary. And Alana, thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Moving forward, we're just going to talk about moving forward and potential response planning in Rhode Island. So given what Lisa presented, the next step in the evolution of our story was just bringing on John Mitchell from NEBNR, that's the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Don't ask me to say that one again. And that's really what opened up our foray into fall trapping. And that's because John came on board. He contacted Lisa and Kevin and said, hey, we have some pine barrens out on Prudence Island in Narragansett Bay. I'd like to monitor for Southern Pine Beetle. We see some mortality, but not, large spots or anything like that. And that occurred in the springtime, the fall of 2022. What we found out with John's fall trapping was like what many of the other reports have been today, is that our fall trap numbers were much higher than our spring. So that graph on the left there shows just our spring numbers up until 2022, which we then had fall trap catches from Prudence Island. So, whereas we caught, just a couple hundred in the spring, just let alone on Prudence Island, we had like over 1,500 beetles in that just short, like 8-week window. So yeah, the fall trapping resulted in hundreds more of Southern Pine Beetle and much more than the other Rhode Island traps. So that kind of sparked us, Lisa and I, to continue, like Lisa said, expanding our trapping season to see, what's really going on with our dynamics in Rhode Island. And yeah, same thing as everybody's reporting here. When you break it down, John's traps out on Prudence Island have been really helpful for us to look at some patterns. The fall numbers accumulate much higher than the spring, and that accumulation occurs largely past that 6-week spring window of monitoring that we all originally started doing. So, about 90% of that is after August. So John's traps very, very low numbers until really the end of August, and then they really just shoot up into maybe like October, November here in Rhode Island. But like Lisa said, we are seeing this growing trend, everybody else a little bit too. Just over time, our numbers are getting much higher. Our fall trap counts, that's, John's traps, Lisa's traps, and my traps of fall 2024, we collectively counted over 5,000 beetles. So we are seeing an increase in numbers. That is concerning to us. And we're just kind of wondering, why don't we, largely seeing attack trees? Lisa mentioned there was that one tree where they found SPB when Matt Ayers came. But other than that, we have been doing pretty extensive survey with our capabilities to find attack trees, and we just aren't finding them. That trend is sparking us to want to formulate some level of a response to Rhode Island, especially given what we know has been happening recently in Massachusetts that Nicole will talk about momentarily. So we're just trying to get our ducks in order right now. So some of the current efforts that we are working on, first of all, one question I had was, well, maybe we're just not looking in the right place. We don't know what we don't know. So we are extensively monitoring, but of course, we don't have our eyes on every tree out there. We have very poor inventory data in our state properties as well in Rhode Island. And on top of it, we don't really have like really any like timber typing, forest typing, GIS data sources. So that's what led into working with Justin Williams from the Forest Service Durham Field Office to map and prioritize Rhode Island pitch pine stands. So I'm not going to really talk much about that because Justin has an awesome presentation in a few minutes. His work, doing the remote sensing modeling for Rhode Island, but basically we were finding that, there are some various sources of, pitch pine species level distribution. We were finding that with some ground truthing that they're just very inaccurate, land fire, something that came out of, forest health protection. And then we have like a Rhode Island ecological communities map. Just largely, none of them were really very accurately representing what we were trying to find, especially when we did some ground truthing. So Justin did some great work. He did some visiting with us to create a model that is looking like it's a lot more accurate in predicting where pitch pine is in Rhode Island. That's going to help us prioritize where we should do our further monitoring, and if where our highest value stands that we really need to pay attention to, whether that's further monitoring, prevention, or treatment if needed. Additionally, we had a student, she was actually my intern of last spring. She's a master's student at Clark University, Thea Henry. She conducted for her honors research project this past winter using the hazard rating tool that was published by Jameson et al. In 2022 to further prioritize our high-risk areas in Rhode Island. So Thea took our 12 SPB trapping sites in the state, and she conducted the risk modeling, including the basal air measurements, the soil texture measurements, and fed that all into the model that was published to do sort of a hazard rating in Rhode Island. So we're still kind of working through that data right now, but very happy to have Thea, her lab partner Cecilia, and their advisor Dominic Kulikowski from Clark University to help us further prioritize our high-risk areas. So that's all leading into us attempting to build a response in Rhode Island. One thing that we already did set up was a framework for crick treatment response on our state lands. We already had sort of a line item in our green bond fund, so that's state money, $5 million that goes to forest habitat and restoration. We had a line item in there for thinning of spongy moth attacked oak trees. What our state lands program did is they added the detail of being able to thin pine beetle attacked pine trees into that line item. So that's what we're calling sort of reactive thinning with our green bond money. So if we did get some spots, attacked trees on state lands, we do have something in place that we could try to act a little bit quickly without having to jump through too many hoops. Additionally, this webinar is great because this is our first step into working with our in-state partners to offer the tools for our non-state lands response. So Lisa mentioned the many partners that we work with that have been supportive of our trapping efforts, and we want to give that back to offer tools in the tool belt in case there is a response needed. Additionally, where time and resources permit, we'd like to conduct outreach to private landowners. And that is just because, our pitch pine distribution definitely spreads over that patchwork of state land, local conservation land, and private land, small parcels of land, just all, adjoining. So we understand, and this has probably been the case in Long Island, that, if you get an outbreak, they're not just sticking to our conservation lands. Additionally, Nebner has proposed to pilot thinning treatments on Prudence Island, so that is potentially in the works. And if that's John Mitchell again, if he's successful with that, we would hope to learn from him and see what we can do on mainland Rhode Island. But also, we're just generally here today, especially to learn from other states, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And I think a hot topic is, what do we do after, if there is an after? So with that, I wanted to extend a thank you to, definitely all of our partners involved, but especially, our federal partners. Kevin has been so supportive of what we wanted to do here, and Justin's been really great to work with our, our limited resources here and help us accomplish a bit more with what we have been given. So thanks everyone. And here's our contact information if anybody needs it. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Nicole Kelleher, who's going to give the Massachusetts update.
Thank you. Okay. So here in Massachusetts, we've been seeing it's not anything that different from what all the other states have kind of been bringing up, but having this kind of building population and reaching some of these critical thresholds. So as many of you probably know, here in Massachusetts, most of our pitch pine resources are in our south coastal areas. We do have some smaller interior stands and some of those smaller like ridgetop pitch pine. But the real bulk of the area that is attractive to the southern pine beetle are our coastal areas on the Cape and the island. But we have been trapping throughout the state, and as you saw in the map Kevin showed, that we've found southern pine beetle throughout the state, and we've been trapping consistently since 2015. And when we look, we find southern pine beetle, but it is in those really small numbers. It's not always consistently in a lot of sites each year. The sites we were kind of finding it more repetitively were like out on the islands year to year. And I will say this graph is I cut some stuff off to make it actually look good, but we were really not finding very much through 2019, 2020 because of the pandemic. We didn't do trapping. 2021, I was on maternity leave and we didn't do trapping. And then we came back in 2022 and found just a lot more beetles than we had been finding, and we're really kind of getting concerned. And then by 2023, we started finding active infestations in the state, and we can kind of see these numbers increase, and we did start to incorporate that fall trapping too to catch those bigger increases and pulses that others were finding. Last year in fall 2024, we were getting like extreme catch rates. The traps were only up for a 2-week window, and we were getting thousands of beetles in multiple traps. At 4 of the sites, there were trees in the adjacent area that were showing signs of active attack that were probably lured in by the traps. So we decided to actually take down all of the traps after that 2-week window, except for some of the interior stands we felt more comfortable with. And all of the trees that were showing those attack signs and potential signs of infestation were cut immediately and thrown directly into a chipper, just to be really cautious. And at that point, we know we have southern pine beetle in the state. We know that it's in these really pitch pine heavy resources in the southeast corridor. What are we gaining from trapping versus some of the risks? So kind of assessing where we want to go forward with some of our trapping. And how to incorporate other survey efforts in that. So we did do ground surveys around all of our trap sites this winter, and then again in the spring around those ones that had the attack trees nearby, just to confirm that we're not kind of building a bigger population in those areas. And we didn't find any additional signs and no other suspicious trees. But doing some of these visual surveys in high risk locations instead of this trapping when we know that there's beetles present in the area. So going into this spring, we decided to not trap out on the Cape or the islands, just because we know these areas are at risk. We know there is a high population present, and instead decided to focus more in our interior pitch pine stands. So these more isolated pockets, these more unique pitch pine barrens, areas that are being actively managed to either enhance or restore pitch pine or barren resources, to kind of see what the risk is in those sites and conditions. We're still going through our trap results, so don't have those numbers yet, but based on kind of what we see there, what we see over this spring, determining what the fall trapping needs are going to be and kind of where it's outrating those risk versus rewards in many of those sites. We've also been getting a ton of public reports, and thankfully all of the public reports we've been getting this year and at the end of last summer were a lot of turpentine beetle. We've had a lot of periods of drought, and we just kind of have some stressed out pitch pine that are susceptible to turpentine, and it's very easy to go and assess those and determine it's not Southern Pine Beetle. But we do have multiple confirmed infestations, and we first found individual trees in 2022. These were near trap sites. They were low signs of attack, but we were once again really cautious and removed and chipped those trees immediately. Never saw any other signs in those sites. But the first outbreaks were detected in 2023, and it was kind of this simultaneous thing where on Nantucket and on Martha's Vineyard, there were multiple spots that were having these true outbreak conditions. So multiple infested trees, tree mortality, and a spreading population. And then this last winter, we first had the first confirmation in Barnstable County, which is the county that Cape Cod lies on. So we're seeing these kind of rapid mortality kind of all at once. So we just reached that threshold where conditions were finally perfect. So the pocket out on Nantucket was managed and currently is kind of low level. The populations on Martha's Vineyard are still incredibly active and spreading. And then this small pocket here, which I'll talk later a little bit about our response, is technically on a very small island close to shore. So not yet on the mainland, but we are kind of reaching those conditions where we have these huge populations on the islands. We have wind conditions that are pushing it towards the mainland and kind of just driving that population into those pitch pine resources and kind of putting them at risk. And I will say right now, like we just flew our aerial survey like 3 weeks ago, and we mapped a significant amount of mortality basically throughout most of the western portion of Martha's Vineyard. So it is still actively infested in trees and actively spreading throughout those areas. Basically that whole western slope that has pitch pine resources. There's also a huge amount of mortality from beech leaf disease out on that section of the island too. So the forests are kind of a mess, and just from aerial survey, it can be a little tricky pulling out which mortality is beech, what is pitch pine, where are they overlapping, and it is a huge loss of canopy cover right now on the island. And I know, like, as one of you that are out in forest kind of know, sometimes what you see with your eyes, you can't always capture with a picture, but you can kind of see these gray areas are just this widespread rapid mortality. So within 2 years, we have lost thousands of acres of pitch pine on Martha's Vineyard. So we're kind of at those conditions that Long Island was really seeing about 10 years ago at this point. So we're very cautious moving forward. Continuing to monitor, finding early detection when it reaches the main land of the Cape and that southeast area to kind of be able to do rapid response. Working on public outreach with other land groups. We do get public responses and questions, and I know sometimes when you're in the field season, it can be really hard to respond to those, but it is incredible that people are listening and caring and reaching out, and it's valuable to know that landowners and homeowners are really concerned about this issue too. And as Polly mentioned, I did get a new position, so I use the we a lot in this, but I am now with Mass Wildlife, not with DCR's Forest Health Program. And for those of you that have contacted me before, I actually got a new email address, so it's just Nicole Kelleher too. And they have not yet backfilled my position with the Forest Health Program. So if you do have Southern Pine Beetle questions, you can still feel free to reach out, and I will share it with the right people, and if I can, answer things. And I believe it is back to you, Polly, for questions.
Perfect. Can you
Yeah, it looks like Polly may have froze up. Do we have any, I don't see any questions in the chat, but, is there anything that has come up for anybody? Um, about any of the previous talks or anything in general about Southern Pine Beetle? Don't see anything comes up or anything like that.
There's a question in the chat, Kevin.
Okay. So, what are the predators to Southern Pine Beetle? So Southern Pine Beetle does have to deal with a lot of sort of chaos in those trees and then outside of the trees when they're attacking too. But I think the primary predators, and Jess, you can correct me if you're talking about what Jess and the work in New York with her colleagues is. I mean, most of that would be claret beetles. So Panasinus dubius is the primary, but there's a lot of other. There's a scarab beetle that prey on the eggs. Competition is a big factor, especially as populations of southern pine beetle. So if you know, like pine sawyers, the large beetles, the large cerevisids that make like the chewing sound in dying or dead. Pine, those will feed on, incidentally feed on larvae in tree. And then I see Alex, there are parasitoids as well. I think there's, boy, I haven't found this stuff in a while, but 5 or 6 species of parasitoids that are important, at least in the southeast. And I think Caroline Kanaski's work, she identified those up here as well. So there's a lot going on in the trees, just with predators and competitors. There's also, of course, fungi interactions as well. And then there's storage on the outside. So, and Alex, none of us do monitor parasitoids. I think when I've done that in the past in the southeast, that was taking bark samples and then rearing, these little samples out to see what species were there. So it's a little bit different type of survey. You wouldn't be able to do that with the traps, unfortunately. Let's see. Okay, Wolf asks, is there a risk to white pine if the beetle runs out of hard pine species to feed on? So that's a great question. And I think, we've seen, I wasn't too worried about white pine. I think that was kind of a collective, view of southern pine beetle in the northeast, that white pine, had been attacked before when it was a host, but it didn't seem to really produce a lot of beetles where it had run into it before. We saw a lot of, more relatively speaking, a lot of white pine mortality last year and the year before on Long Island. And so these were really, really overstocked stands. A lot of the population of southern pine beetle was very high in the area. And so I wouldn't go so far as to call them spillover attacks in the white pine. They were directed attacks, in those stands, some of which were not directly adjacent to pitch pine or anything that would infest it. So we have a paper out in but what we saw is the trees were readily attacked. They were attacked very heavily, but they generally didn't produce very many beetles. Unfortunately, those trees then died. So the trees ended up losing anyways, even though they fought off the beetle for the most part. And so, some beetles come out of it, but I don't think it would be a situation where white pine would sustain southern pine beetle. Are we seeing any pitch pine regeneration in areas heavily infested? Jess, do you have anything to say on that one about like what you and Rob and others have seen on Long Island?
In terms of pitch pine regeneration?
What's that?
In terms of pitch pine regen?
Yeah, where there's been like either suppression or infestation of the web.
Yeah, so definitely in the areas obviously that we're burning, we're getting the most regen because it just helps to scarify the soil a bit. And there's a lot of duff accumulation on Long Island from years of fire suppression. So I think sometimes in areas where we've just had like cut and leave suppression and we have big open areas, there is some pitch pine regen. But we often just see regeneration like of other plant species that have been suppressed due to previous closed canopy forests, but like not as much pitch pine specific regen. Because again, you really need to get down to that mineral soil again, and it's going to take a little while in some locations on Long Island. But there's other New York partners on here that might see differently on their properties. So if anyone wants to speak up and add to that, but yeah, so some. But again, in the areas we burned, very vigorous. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later as well.
Yeah, and I'll hit on some of that too, but let's see. All right.
I can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Hey, Polly.
Okay, sorry. My computer's acting up. Yeah, I can add on to what Jess was sharing about regeneration. Is the areas are active disturbance, whether it's from fire or from the tracks of masticators, is providing enough disturbance to get some regeneration if there's still seed available from persisting or surviving adjacent pines and along trails and roadways. So areas where you see a lot of impact of Southern Pine Beetle along the roads are those areas where inherently pitch pine is actively growing because of that soil disturbance in the past, and also the sun resources, etc. And that's why it's been so active in spreading, along with being a lazy flyer along these corridors. But that's also the area where you're also seeing it being, the pines being highly impacted. And so the dog-haired pine regeneration that we're seeing is occurring in some of those 2008 oak mortality areas, but in the areas where we've had Southern Pine Beetle, we haven't seen that regeneration, with exception of where soil disturbance has occurred, whether it's from fire, mastication, or along those trails and corridors where there's a little bit more active mowing or management or treading by people. And seeing also if there is white pine in the area, the white pine recruit.
Okay, thanks, Polly. We'll take this one last question from Troy, and then we'll go to break. I think would be a wise decision at this point. We can get back on schedule, and not that we're on schedule not too much. Are wind currents blowing the beetles over long distances the primary means of Southern Pine Beetle dispersion from one geographic location to the next in the Northeast? So it's hard to say. Bark beetles certainly disperse, or aided in dispersal by wind. I think, you can look at the map and envision that wind-driven events, play some part of that. So I don't know that it's the primary driver of any of like the long distance moves that we've seen, like into New Hampshire and Maine, because I mean there's a couple ways to look at it, right? But once we have these pheromone traps out, and it's a good pheromone, but it's not going to attract beetles from, even probably 100 meters away. And so it's hard to think of, a population of beetles coming out of Long Island or in Massachusetts and getting blown, up into Maine or New Hampshire and then navigating to traps. So I kind of feel like we probably have these background populations on the landscape that are very affected by those, those cold snaps, and then aided by long distance dispersal, pushed by wind movements. But I think it's a great question, and it's very much up for debate. I'm sure there's I know there's people on here that would have different interpretation of how common that there's wind events are. Okay, so Holly, what do you think? We'll break and come back at 10:20. That gives 8 minutes. We can push a little bit more. What do you think?
Yeah, that would be great if folks can take a quick 8-10 minute break, and we'll start up again in around 10:20.
All right, so a little switch up. We'll have Alex and and Nicole will talk about some of their efforts getting ready for Southern Pine Beetle and dealing with Southern Pine Beetle in Massachusetts. So Alex is you're with what, Mass Wildlife, and then we heard from Nicole already in her new position is with Mass Wildlife too. So, all right, take it over.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so I'm the Prescribed Fire Project leader with Mass Wildlife, and I was just going to talk a little bit about the work we're doing in Pine Barrens. We don't have active infestations on our wildlife management areas, but it's something that we've been thinking about for a little while, and just wanted to share a little bit about what we've been up to. So for background, Mass Wildlife is the Fish and Wildlife Agency for the state of Massachusetts. So we're responsible for fish, wildlife, endangered plants and animals, and we restore, protect, and manage the habitat.
Hey, Alex, I don't
Yes.
see, have you shared your screen?
Oh, I did. Yeah, let me try again then.
I wasn't sure if you were just going to go old school. No.
Oh, no. I've got, let's see here. Try again. How's that?
It's coming up. Yeah,
Okay.
you're up.
But you didn't miss much. So we're the Fish and Wildlife Agency, as I said, and so we have a pretty strong interest in Pine Barrens. We have a legislative mandate through the State Wildlife Action Plan to manage for species of greatest conservation need and the habitats that support them. And 135 of the 365 upland SGCN occur in Pine Barrens. So with our responsibility for managing for rare and threatened species, the Pine Barrens is really important to us. So we've been managing in Pine Barrens long before Southern Pine Beetle was on the radar, but it's become more urgent since that kind of problem has arisen. Just kind of overviewing what's gone on in the state for restoration projects. And, Polly's going to talk about some of the ecology and the win-wins that go along, I guess, opportunities for Pine Barrens management. Is that the restoration projects we've been working on include thinning and prescribed fire, which helps create habitat for many of the rare species. It also reduces wildfire risk for crown fires, which there's a long history of large and catastrophic fires in Southeast Mass. But also, that thinning and burning reduces the hazard for Southern Pine Beetle. Some of the projects that have been going on, Miles Standish Complex, which you can see here with the latest Google Earth imagery, is probably the largest in the state, 1,600 acres of thinning. A lot of that has had one or more prescribed fires in the area, and that continues to grow. So we're looking at over 10 years, around 1,600 acres there, and we got more planned for this coming season. Montague Plains is the inland Pine Barrens along the Connecticut River Valley. That's had around 1,000 acres of thinning where white pine and pitch pine and some oak has been thinned. And then there's been prescribed fire program there. And then we have other sites across, Southeast Mass primarily, like Francis Crane, Mashpee Pine Barrens that have been also had overstory thinning and prescribed fire, so there's a hodgepodge there. It's not probably, I would say it's a start. There's, at least 200,000 acres probably in Massachusetts of pitch pine habitat. So it's pretty much a drop in the bucket on what's needed overall, but it has been, it is a start. Another way we've been involved kind of more directly in pine beetle work is through our habitat management grant program. That's state money that is awarded through a competitive grant process to can go to nonprofits or other kind of non-state landowners. They apply for the grants, and we can fund a few projects, and we've had a focus the last couple of years on Southern Pine Beetle. It's gotten a fair bit of the funding. Those have been mostly on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, where we've funded some of them you can see, and it's not enough to cover all the costs. There's been a lot of fundraising and other ways that the projects have been funded, but you can see here Sheriff's Meadow project on Martha's Vineyard, where they started as a suppression cut. Beetles sort of broke containment, and it turned into more of a kind of sanitation cut where they were cutting the dead trees, and then brought in a company from New Jersey with the air curtain burner, and they've been processing some of the wood, turning it into bio char, and then you can see the logs there. So this is a restoration effort. It's being monitored, and that's one of the projects, but there's been others, including some prescribed fire on inland barrens as well. Another project we've been working on is a statewide assessment for pitch pine ecosystem vulnerability to Southern Pine Beetle. It's a report that hopefully we'll be finishing up soon. We contracted a forestry company to go sample plots across the Commonwealth in areas where there was pitch pine, where it was like pitch pine habitat. And then we applied the Jameson et al. Model. And then we were comparing it to a couple of models. So you have the U.S. Forest Service tree map model, and there was a model made out of Harvard that has tree composition, density, basal areas, all of that sort of thing monitored. And so we were comparing the sampled data against some of these models, and then making recommendations for just pine beetle management, prevention, and things like that. So this is still kind of in draft form, and we hope to finish it up soon. And I'll be really interested after hearing Elena's presentation to see how that modeling has worked out, and maybe there's a way to hopefully improve it, because we found through this that neither the tree map or the Harvard map did particularly well with picking up the right basal area for the pitch pine. They weren't terribly accurate, so it'd be nice to have a better model out there. And that's kind of it for me, and I'll kick it over to Nicole, who can talk a little more about other stuff going on in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Alex. So a big thing has been kind of being prepared and this preventative work. And it was kind of an inevitability of knowing that we've been tracking it, we know it's coming, waiting for this like significant outbreak, and kind of what that response would look like. And I mean, all of you know, or here because we know it is an incredibly destructive insect, and it causes huge amounts of tree mortality and can be a big issue. And I don't have great news about some of our work, but things that I think are really positive was that we were generally prepared because we knew it was coming, we knew what to expect, had kind of developed these response plans. We had other landowners and partners and nonprofits that were we had great messaging and had developed these relationships so that when other people found it, they knew what they were looking at and kind of how to address it too. So we first found these kind of hit that perfect threshold in 2023, where we kind of had these simultaneous outbreaks on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. And kind of it was like three main locations. So one on Nantucket with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, on Martha's Vineyard with the Sheriff's Meadow Foundation, and then in the state forest. And kind of what went on in the state forest is what I'm going to focus on. But basically all three groups kind of took initial suppression actions in the fall of 2023. So pretty rapid response from initial detection to response and on the ground work. And I will say, beyond all of these sites being found on the ground, we did pick them up during our aerial survey efforts. So there are kind of, it is good to know that those tools are kind of pulling out these outbreaks when they're still relatively small in size. So kind of showing the areas where we have had outbreaks thus far. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Manny Corral State Forest, it's in the interior part of Martha's Vineyard Island. So we first picked this up during our aerial survey in June of 2023. When I went out, initial site found that it was Southern Pine Beetle, and the initial delineation of the site found 3 smallish pockets, a little under 100 trees, and kind of a total area under like 2 acres. And we began suppression cuts in 2023 that were completed in-house by our forest health staff. We're kind of fortunate that our forest health program is structured in a way where our state parks hazard tree crews are also under the same umbrella. So we have a crew of an amazing arborists already at hand that have saws and skills. It was just really figuring out some of the logistics of getting out to the island. And that was the hardest part, because it is an island. You have to get there on a ferry. It is expensive to travel there. It is challenging to get there. And for those that have never been to Martha's Vineyard, the state forest is basically the big block right in the center of the island. And it was a small pocket within that block where we had these small areas of infested trees, and then the buffer we were going to cut around it. And our suppression cuts happened in September, so we initially found it in June, confirmed it in July, did the delineation. But there's a lot of challenges to doing this suppression work and cuts. The biggest of which for us was northern long-eared bat habitat, which restricts cutting in the roosting months. And then some of the challenges of just getting to a island that has huge tourism. The ferries book up, getting equipment out there, getting our staff resources and time out there. So it wasn't until late September when we began our cuts out there. And it took our crews 4 days to do the full cuts at those sites. And since we were on an island, challenging to get out there, we did do a cut and leave method. So all trees were downed, limbed up, split the bark up, with our forest health crews that were just out there doing most of it by hand. We did bring our skid steer out to help move some of the material. And at first the crews were really cautious, like following a single route in and out. And I was like, no, drive that skid steer wherever you can get it. And when we kind of went, it's still very early to know regeneration success, but you can see in some of the paths where we drove the equipment, there are quite a few more seedlings that are noticeable. And I will say, like, at the end of this, it felt good. We felt accomplished. We had all the trees down. It was fairly effective and a efficient response with the limited resources that we had available to us. We came back the next spring and did some follow-up cuts, which was a pretty limited. We did about 50 additional trees on the edge that were either suspicious, symptomatic, and then an additional buffer around those. And it was really just not new areas, just extending out of that initial point. Once again, cut and leave. We did this in 2 days with our crew. And we came back in July to assess this site. And there were probably like 15 to 20 trees that were suspicious in July. Once again, right in the middle of that bat roosting season, and high summer season, so not able to do work. By the time we came back at the beginning of September, it was like 400 to 500 infested and dead trees. So it blew up really quickly in that kind of 2-month time period, and was beyond our ability to manage by doing hand level work of cutting and leaving at that point. So you can kind of see this is what the site looked like prior to an infestation. And then you can kind of see those 2 main pockets where we did our cuts. That was a little over 2.5 acres where we did our cuts. And then this is what we saw in June during our aerial survey acres. So it's about 5.5 to 6 acres estimated right now of active mortality. There's probably more that has spread in the few weeks since that time. And I think most of this spread has come from cutting and leaving, that there were still beetles emerging from it, that this was a really dense pitch pine stand. These trees were very close together. You're following them, the trees are kind of like right all on top of them. And like all those beautiful pictures where it shows like falling trees in towards the center. Like pitch pines are gnarly. They don't have like a beautiful straight growth form. They are on like twisted trunks, and they're very tight and they get caught up. So even when you're trying your best to cut an efficient buffer and to fall trees inward, you can end up where trees are too close to healthy trees, where you're not getting enough of that airflow. And I think from the cutting and leaving, it really allowed the population to maintain on that site. It is like, it does sometimes feel disheartening, but I don't think we would have done things differently. This was our first outbreak event. It was an effort to try to slow it down, to retain some of this pitch pine. We don't know if it'll extend beyond this. We can kind of see those fire roads and how it did jump the line in the one section, but it is a widespread issue. This is the area by the Sheriff's Meadow Foundation, and you can kind of see where their cut is and how the population spread around there. And that population was much more aggressive, that by the time they were cutting in the fall of 2023, they were just like falling behind it. It was just so many beetles moving so quickly through those stands and jumping into neighboring properties, that we just have a very dense population right now on the island. And kind of looking at prior to infestation in that part of the island versus now, and you can see there's been quite a significant loss in our pitch pine resource there. And there's just a lot of, I will say, you can always go into this with the mind of like best management practices and kind of what you want to do for a suppression cut. And that is not always practical in the real world. And here in Massachusetts, a big kind of factor in that is how much human development we have on the landscape. So like some of the historic Southern Pine Beetle work and data that you read from the South, it's in these big timber stands where they're timber managing and harvesting timbers, but we are managing pitch pine that are kind of serpentine between neighborhoods and properties, and it's not always very easy to kind of follow those standard protocols and being efficient with the resources you have in these kind of unusual landscapes. So we did that work on Martha's Vineyard. We're still kind of thinking about next steps in the state forest of how to deal with the standing dead trees and kind of that continuing spreading population. But we did have another state property pop up with confirmed infested trees this last winter. So this is Washburn Island, which is just off the coast of like where Falmouth and Mashpee are. And it is very close to the coast, but it is a small island and can only be accessed by boat. But the Wyquat Bay National Estuarine Research Center is part of their property. And while they were out doing work, out boating past the island, they saw suspicious trees and we're like, hey, we should check that out. Those trees look not good. And when they went and looked, they saw the popcorning and gave me a call, and we all went out and confirmed that it was Southern Pine Beetle. And this island has some habitat restrictions in place, just because of how it's classified within our state properties. And it is also an active campground. And where the trees were found was right on the shoreline, right in the campground. So beyond just dealing with this pest, it is also dealing with the safety of having dead and dying trees in the campground. So we decided to do a cut. It occurred in February. And this was a really conservative approach. I don't like to call this a suppression cut because we didn't do like the full buffer and everything, because it is right on the shoreline, right in a campground. So kind of losing the stability that these trees are providing, but also losing the canopy cover in this campground. It is a campground that is basically 90% pitch pine overstory. And it is a relatively small campground because it's only accessible by boat and has a limited number of campsites, but it is still actively used for camping. So this is a joint effort between our DCR Forest Health Hazard Tree Crews, DCR Fire Control staff, and the Webner Park operations crew. And we went out, cut around 45 trees in this little clump. All materials were kind of stacked on site, and later in the season, in the late summer, early spring, those brush piles were burned on site, but there still is maintaining materials still on site. So this is a site where we're going to need to keep reassessing, making sure that we're not having active infestations, outbreaks, beyond just the challenges of like having this population spread, but maintaining, like, we all know that these trees can die very quickly, and it very quickly becomes a safety risk when people are sleeping underneath them. So maintaining some of those concerns. And it'll be kind of interesting to monitor and detect how these more conservative cuts are effective. This might have been a hot spot that maybe on its own would have burned out. It was fairly small right on the edge. But it was something that we did need to take action for at this site, and kind of seeing how effective some of these methods can be going forward. Because there are a lot of these challenges of when we can do work, how we can do work, like the endangered species concern, traveling to these remote islands. Like for Washburn Island, we could only go on this tiny little boat with just enough room for the crews and our saws, no additional equipment, and weren't able to remove any of those materials off site. So how are we able to respond rapidly, effectively? There are a lot of funding limitations for many different entities and landowners, and what this kind of increased fuel load and limited wood disposal options are going to be long term. So right now, we don't think there are many additional pockets, but we flew our aerial survey at the end of June. Nothing really stood out that was like incredibly alarming that we're like, we have to go out right now and make sure this isn't another Southern Pine Beetle outbreak pocket anywhere on like the mainland. But it is kind of, we know it's possible. We know that we have a population that is established. How can we efficiently do this? And there's a lot of challenges to things like permitting. The work done on Martha's Vineyard required cutting plans. The work we did on Washburn Island had to go through the Town Conservation Commission and get approvals for that. So how does this kind of work fit into regulations and permitting and all of those challenges going forward? So I will say that my results are, I don't think it's a waste of time to be doing these cuts, but it is something that we kind of need to keep planning long term about what it looks like. And there may be sites where if your only options are cutting and leaving, it may not be worth the effort because we are kind of seeing continued outbreaks at those sites too. But once again, if you have questions about it, always feel free to reach out.
That's great, Nicole. Thank you so much. And thanks, Alex. I think I'll touch on some of this too, Nicole, in my talk, but just hearing like the realities of, what the trade-offs that you have to work through and decisions is, I think, really helpful for people because our landscapes are so different than where everything was developed, and just, taking the recipe from the South and using it up here, it's not the same, and we've got to work through those issues. So I appreciate all the effort you guys are doing out there. It's great. So we'll hold questions until the end, just to keep on. Polly, or I can go next if you're not set.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, I'm gonna give it a go.
Right. Good luck.
Let me share my screen. All right, are you seeing my slideshow view?
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna leave my camera off. I don't expect it'll turn on if I try, so apologies for the technical challenges. It wouldn't be a online webinar without some technical challenge, so audio is better than video in this case. So as the Northeast Fire Projects Manager, for the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange and the Guild, one of the areas and expertise I bring to the table is having worked with all of the entomologists and land managers, and being a land manager myself in my previous role with the Central Pine Barrens Commission, where I was the Science and Stewardship Program Manager. Was collecting and observing and reflecting on Southern Pine Beetle. And while, yes, massively devastating of an insect, very impressive insect for such a little yet mighty beast, and its ability to quickly reproduce, successfully disperse and spread, infest trees, cause the mass mortality, burrow through that thick bark. It's just, a phenomenon in and itself, in addition to being devastating. And so I call myself an eternal optimist. And so that capacity, I put together this presentation, which titled "The Silver Linings of Southern Pine Beetle in the Pine Barrens," because while it has been massively devastating, as this picture shows, with the two interns hiking through a section of East Quogue in the Pine Barrens in 2014, of just showing the mass impact that Southern Pine Beetle has in completely resetting succession in this barren area, that it's also had significant benefit to us as land managers, as entomologists, to those that are truly trying to protect the Pine Barrens, and as an overall ecosystem, and put the right management on the ground. And so this presentation is a combination of those reflections, highlighting the benefits and the negatives, or rather the challenges, but then also providing different messaging to help us further collectively move forward with the management that we're trying to advance. So just quickly, for those that aren't aware, is that the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange is part of the greater federally funded Joint Fire Science Exchange program, and this is their website, and we can put the links into the chat. But they have a overall program that extends across the country, and you can see here in this map of the 16 different regions that specifically focus on bringing and connecting advancing fire science and information related to fire science and active management of ecosystems to land managers and to the public. And in the Northeast is us, the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, which Eric Evanson and I are both staff members of, and work in collaboration and participation with the USDA as Forest Service, as well as work in collaboration with our other constituents across the United States and the Fire Science Exchange. The Fire Science Exchange does have these Friday flash news, so you can scan on the QR code, and we'll also put the link in the web on the chat. And so I highlighted this a little bit, but the overall benefits and goals of the Science Exchange Network is really to share the information and build relationships across our region, to identify advancing research, both the needs for advancing research and the synthesis of and dispersal of that information. Demonstrate the research and that is occurring on the ground to help and support that adaptive management, and provide the support and funding, and also the staff time to put on programs and events similar to this workshop. So if you have any interests or ideas or needs related to fire science management, forest management, ecosystem management as a whole, with the connection to fire, please reach out to Eric or I. Related to the Forest Stewards Guild, we have a lot of references related to fire and building fire capacity across the country and across ecosystems. So the Forest Stewards Guild is the agency that holds the contract for my time and effort and contribution to administering the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. And if you go to our website, you can see under resources, you can access many of these different resources that have been published. So here's the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. This is who Eric and I represent on our website. You can find a wealth of resources related to education and outreach, seminars that we've done previously, research briefs and other papers, and a wealth of other resources. There's also, if you were able to access this webinar through our newsletter, you're already on our newsletter, but if you haven't received that, we'll be adding you to our newsletter list by proxy of signing up for this program. So shifting into the silver linings related to Southern Pine Beetle, you know, we all recognize and are all here in the efforts that we're advancing to protect the Pine Barrens ecosystems along the Atlantic coastal plain that extend from New Jersey all the way up into Massachusetts and into Maine, into southern Maine. And this globally rare ecosystem occurs only in these coastal sands in the world. And so it's extremely rare. And yet, while numerous efforts have been invested in them, it continues to be a declining ecosystem. This shows some of the ranks related to the ecosystems themselves for New York. So obviously that's where I've been working for a larger part of my career. So apologies to other areas, other states. But this does illustrate and capture many of the similar rankings for these systems within the other states represented here. But you can see the massive number of globally rare ecosystems that occur within this larger Pine Barrens complex, and also the number of rare and endangered species that are supported within some of these listed ecosystems themselves. So the curiosity and the challenge that we experience with Southern Pine Beetle is that we all recognize the global rarity and the function and the benefit of these systems, and have put protections in place like the Central Pine Barrens protection area here, which is defined, as well as the other protection areas that have occurred in New Jersey and up along the coast in other states. And so if these protection areas related to land use and ecosystem protections are in place, then why are we experiencing the outbreaks of Southern Pine Beetle to such devastating impacts that we have seen since 2014, when the mass outbreak occurred and detection occurred in New York? So in 2010, New Jersey really experienced their worst outbreak, and so it wasn't surprising that the detections had reached outbreak stage when we look at the invasive species curve, to such a degree that it was visually evident that there was something going on within our ecosystems. But why was Southern Pine Beetle so very effective in establishing outside, escaping the invasive species predator-prey relationships and those suppressions? Was the fact that our forests within our Pine Barrens ecosystems, while we had protected the boundaries, we had not protected and recognized fully. And when I say we, you know, there's a general we. There was the lack of recognition and understanding, but no particularly fault or blame being pointed. It's just the reality that we had been very successful in protecting the boundaries and the land uses, but we hadn't recognized or advanced the active management that was necessary for the long-term wildfire suppression that had occurred. And that disturbance that the Pine Barrens are, it's a disturbance-dependent ecosystem, and the main disturbance is wildfire, had been suppressed for 400 years in association with European colonization. And as a result, what occurred was the protection, especially of these highly ecological valued ecosystems and parks, land, public trust, were not actively managed. And so they became overstocked, highly dense stands, basal areas of 120 to 220 feet per acre squared. And I have my square wrong there. I apologize. So these systems being starved of fire, the impact was that the fire was not actively thinning or reducing these stands, taking out the dead and dying, the young and vulnerable. It wasn't opening these stands to natural recruitment, so you had the even age stands. Much of this, I presume, is I'm preaching to the choir, but it sets us up for why what we saw with mass mortality here is what we now fondly call as beetle bait. And this is the result. It's not necessarily surprising to others, but if you come down to Long Island, the mass mortality is most visually viewed along the roadsides and right-of-ways. This is a impacted stand along the roadside on the South Fork, and this is the impacted stand along the north side of Sunrise Highway, and the south side of the panoramic picture is actually the West Hampton Plains, one of the spots that developed along Sunrise Highway from the West Hampton Plains wildfire that occurred. And so I illustrate and share this picture because it's such a powerful picture of showing the mass decline of pitch pine, but it also illustrates and shows and relates as well of the messaging that Southern Pine Beetle is not causing these wildfires. This stand on the north side of the road is just as susceptible to fire as the south side of the road, as long as the fuel conditions and the ignition source is present and the fuel conditions align. Both are going to be equally likely to develop in a fire. It's just that between these two systems, the impacted stands, the fire behavior will be slightly different. The other aspect is that Southern Pine Beetle had not yet fully reached the other side of this road, but you can see the mass impact and devastation of Southern Pine Beetle along these corridors. One of the other challenges related to Southern Pine Beetle impact, especially when it comes to management and the health and vitality of the system, is that on this picture on the right, I should have switched them, is the resulting on the ground biomass in mass that has occurred due to the mass mortality of pitch pines. So they break down very quickly due to the inoculation of blue stain fungus and other funguses that the beetles naturally inoculate into the tree. The white stain fungus is a food resource for the beetles, but those rapidly cause the decay along with the other secondary bark beetles and insects that utilize the dying pines as habitat. And so this mass dead standing and down fuel load, while it is having a benefit to our ecosystem, silver lining, is the mass disturbance that is critically needed within our pine barren systems. It does not equal the effects of fire because it's not consuming partially or fully the down materials, and is also leaving a mass hazard for us as land managers to address. This is the footprint of the Sunrise wildfire. I'm sorry, not Sunrise, the Crescent Bow of 2012. And you can see how the fire moved through the system. It did kill off the pines and oaks in different capacity. It really reduced the basal area and consumed some of the understory. Some of the heavies are still there and the hazards do exist, but you can see that the pines there are still a number of pines that continue to persist, and the health and vitality of the system post-wildfire. So moving forward in this presentation, I've put together and I identified a lot of the misnomers that have come out related to the silver linings and the lessons learned. And the greatest one is, as I just illustrated, and some of the challenges that we've been facing, is that we're trying to now overcome that preservation mindset, that if we protect the boundaries of these systems and reduce the land uses within them, that we've protected the system. And we've only been able to accomplish half the goal there by protecting and maintaining that system, by protecting the boundaries. The complete protection of a disturbance-dependent system with fire, that is dependent on fire, requires the active disturbance in some capacity to achieve and maintain that system, the species within it, and the function of that system. And All right, I'll go back. Some of the other challenges and misnomers that educational programming and outreach that I'm hoping this presentation helps to dilute or to re-message is that, you know, we were constantly challenged, the land managers. I know DEC was very much challenged with the concept related to that preservation, is that green is good, or that cutting a tree to save a tree doesn't make sense. And that green is good is looking at all of the species. If it's green, then it means it's healthy. Well, Southern pine beetle coming in and turning all of our trees orange and then red and then dead is a strong indicator that green necessarily isn't good, and that we need that active disturbance to maintain that green. And that green then means that we need to provide a proxy for disturbance, the cutting and thinning of the trees, both the pines and the oaks and the other hardwood trees that naturally recruit within these systems, to keep that basal area down below 70 feet per acre squared, to ensure the health and vitality of the system. And that goes into the misnomer of the protection of why would we cut a healthy tree to save a tree, whether it's Southern pine beetle infested related to suppression, or if it is a healthy tree that we're cutting because we're thinning the forest, whether it's through preventative thinning, fuel rearrangement and reorganization to put fire safely on the ground, or to serve as a mechanical treatment in place of fire. It is critically important within these systems, if we're not actively having wildfire to thin, that we do need to cut and thin these trees. And it's not just a one and done. These trees will continue to grow and recruit, and in order to maintain the ideal basal area, we need to actively cut and thin these forests on a regular basis. We may need to do that a little heavier in the restoration phase, since disturbance hasn't been readily occurring to thin, in order to get those basal areas down and the understory vegetation reduced or rearranged for fire. But then we need to transition from restoration to maintenance, and that maintenance is maintaining the goals and the direction of that system in order to have maximal resilience to Southern pine beetle and forest health and wildfire risk reduction. The mighty misnomer is that forest management is expensive, and I highlight that it is a misnomer in that it's expensive. It is expensive in the first investment, as we move in to mitigate and rectify the high fuel loading and dense stands of vegetation that are occurring. But as per the initial investments, the greatest return is provided through the prescribed fire management. To maintain that system is the most cost-effective investment moving forward to obtain and recognize those benefits. Other misnomers: slow moving Southern pine beetle. I hear, and you know, and it's just a natural, I think, you know, we're guilty of it here on Long Island and others in the other parts, but that Southern pine beetle is slow moving, that we didn't expect to arrive so fast. Well, it is slow moving, but it also is arriving, it is moving, it is dispersing, and there's still time to do the preventative thinning and work that is needed in order to build that resiliency within your stands. And I know that this isn't necessarily a land manager challenge, but it's getting the support of the higher level executives and the public, reflective of these other actions above. So we're hoping that these presentations and educational outreach will continue to help provide the support for the funding and the active management that is necessary. And also the reassurance that the system will respond in a highly rejuvenated way with that disturbance. And then lastly, my favorite here, as I'm hoping that everybody got a little chuckle out of this infographic that Dave Zader created for me, is the fact that, you know, Southern pine beetles are causing these wildfires. And I illustrated that back a couple of slides ago, is that Southern pine beetle is not causing these fires. They're not walking around or moving around with fusees or any other, you know, ignition device. They are impacting and changing and rearranging the fuels within the systems, and there is a higher likelihood of wildfire within those stands for about a month or two, if that, when the pine needles are red. But soon as the needles shed off the trees, though that fire behavior actually will, if there is a wildfire that breaks out in the area, will travel through the canopy, and when it reaches the southern pine beetle affected stand of the dead standing pines, will actually drop to the ground and reduce the intensity and the quick movement of the fire, making that fire much more easily able to be contained. So there is that silver lining that of southern pine beetle impact of the reduction and change of the fire risk and the fire behavior, but fire is a natural component of our pine barren systems, and as long as the fuels conditions are aligned and there is an ignition source, it's equally likely to ignite across a pine barren system, regardless of whether it's been impacted or not. So, and then I lied, I have one more, is that fire is not the end all be all of our pine barren system. It is the ideal prescribed fire as a proxy for wildfire to completely help consume the organic matter in the duff and the buildup in the vegetation and reset succession, open up our niches and create and drive our system to more of a barren habitat, as well as release nutrients. But if you're not able to put fire on the ground, there are other active management like mechanical treatments, mastication that you still can do within your forested ecosystem that is going to provide great benefits to reducing the resiliency of southern pine beetle and reducing your wildfire risk. So southern pine beetle, while it is impactful, it does have silver linings, and it's not the bad, bad, bad. It's just bad, bad. So moving forward, and I'm going to just bump through these quickly. In all of that mismessaging, what comes forth to me as a ecologist is the fact that we're missing the goal and we're missing the mark in helping to advance the management of our systems when it comes to understanding ecology. If our leadership and our public are not understanding the ecology of our pine barren systems, and they don't have that understanding, then we are challenged by having them understand why the maintenance we are, or the management that we're advancing. We're challenged at leveraging and trying to promote ourselves and the management within these systems to the public and the executives that we need to be able to embrace. I'm not saying this very well, tongue-tied suddenly. But the point being is that in order for us to get the support of the elected officials and the members of the public, one of the key areas that we need to focus on is conveying pine barrens ecology, because the ecology is the system's response not only to the abiotic conditions, but also to the natural environment. And I use natural with a little asterisk because it's not just the natural environment. We as humans are part of that natural environment, and we, through our urbanization, development, and our wildfire suppression, have significantly been impacting and altering the direction and trajectory of our ecosystems and our ecosystem health. So focusing and learning and highlighting and using presentations that highlight these abiotic conditions that pretty much create the palette on which and substrate on which the ecosystem is going to grow, succeed, and adapt and thrive. And then be how the system has been influenced over time. And when we look at our human and contemporary modifiers, Native Americans were the main purveyor of fire in the landscape to such a degree that it has refined and developed our ecosystems within the Pine Barrens region into fire-dependent systems. European colonization and clear cutting expanded these Pine Barren systems to their maximal extent, but also increased the frequency of wildfires, especially related to transportation and development, that start of that development and encroachment and into permanent settlements that created these wildfires that then were suppressed. And you can see the legacy of the land use history and the impact of deforestation on these on the ground areas across our region related to radio towers and communications and airports. And you can see it captured in the aerial photographs of the different stages of succession and the land use impacts. And so tying the ecology to the Pine Barrens ecosystem of recognizing that the Sunrise Fire here in the Dwarfs, while it was human ignited, was critically necessary and part of the natural fire return interval, and also balancing the human exploitation and urbanization of these systems, is that we need to increase the cultural and ecological awareness of the value of these systems, and then transition the concept of protection from preservation to conservation, that the active management is needed as a proxy for wildfire in order to reset the succession in these Pine Barrens systems. Which is illustrated here. And so restoration and maintenance management is necessary. It is a proxy for wildfire disturbance, that no management is a decision, but there's all these other phases of thinning and management that can be actively implemented within your system, along with monitoring to demonstrate the effects and benefits, and then consideration of, your seeding or plant augmentation of ecotypes. But really the biggest challenge and benefit that we need to focus on, and where NAFC fits in, is trying to help the different agencies and organizations, is advancing that public outreach and education. And then there's also research that's being advanced by entities such as UVM and the Forest Service to really continue to highlight that this is not just the concept of preservation is not just within Pine Barrens or disturbance dependent systems, but it's across the region when you're combining utilitarian use and the conservation of our forested landscapes. So when we look at the silver linings of Southern Pine Beetle, is that the mass devastation really gave us as land managers the critical support of the public and brought to attention that there is a forest management and wildfire risk issue. It also has kickstarted the education and outreach. It has provided the wide-scale disturbance and reset succession and created those barrens. However, it's not equivalent. It does provide a benefit of being wide-scale disturbance, but it's not equivalent to wildfire and consuming the organic matter or reducing hazards. It also has had major impacts on the down amount of woodies in creating smoke management issues for the use of prescribed fire, and also is having questionable recruitment that we are going to continue to observe and monitor to see if reforestation is able to naturally occur without that management. So the goals in moving forward is to differ based on your particular objectives, but the resiliency, the hazard fuel reduction, driving recruitment and regeneration for ecosystem function, providing habitat, and the species fitness collectively are the goals of these education and awareness programs, so that we can get the support that we need from the public. And so just to wrap up, is that Southern Pine Beetle is here to stay. This is the photo that Kevin had referenced as far as the beetle catch after 2 weeks of our first putting up the traps with the new pheromones. You can see the mass biomass just is phenomenal in this photo, but the mass impact is illustrated across the landscape. The other messaging is carrying forth is that we have an ecosystem health and resiliency issue, and that is what Southern Pine Beetle and our wildfire risk is showing us, is that we need to continue to take action and investment in our land managers, the forest management, and active funding of those programs, so that we can continue to move these programs forward to protect these ecosystems that are a sense of place. And while fire is ideal, prescribed fire, if you are not able to do prescribed fire, then mechanical treatments are a suitable replacement. And that active restoration takes place first, but then that maintenance needs to continue and the funding for that. So I wrap it up there and turn it back over to Kevin for the next speaker.
Thanks, Polly. And we'll just move right into the talks, the next talks, and we'll have questions at the end. We'll get a little bit behind. You have to unshare, Polly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's not, I didn't know that I could not share with them. All right, is that up? I had a weird little lag here.
Looks good.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, well, I think all this is sort of tying together nicely. It's what we had hoped to have happen today. And I'm going to cover a lot of different things. It's some of it's sort of the lessons learned in a way. A lot of the, or really all of the information is either, you know, things that I've worked on or our larger Southern Pine Beetle group has, and things that I've learned from, you know, others' efforts that I'm just going to try to summarize here. And you'll hear about some of these too, with like some of a lot of the work that I'll sort of be referencing or touching on is some of the stuff that Jess's crew and Rob and them have been doing on New York, where I think we've learned a lot since, you know, 2014 when Southern Pine Beetle hit, and there was no Southern Pine Beetle program at all until New York stood one up really rapidly. And so I did want to touch on just some biological factors that are really important for management and understanding Southern Pine Beetle. The first, you know, is that it is limited by winter temperatures. We have a really good understanding of that. That allows us to prioritize the landscape. And, you know, I think Nicole alluded to this some, and it's really important further north than Massachusetts right now, where we're thinking about preventative treatments and getting ahead of Southern Pine Beetle and you know how many years you may have until you see damage and things like that. And it allows us to also, you know, survey in those areas aggressively too. It is an aggressive beetle that thrives in hard pine, and you know, Polly just hit on this too. It's really just a beetle responding to the habitat that's out there that exists through really lack of management in a lot of areas anyways. It does have multiple generations, and that's a real problem, right? So once you get that infestation, they don't all grow, but when they do, it can be really rapid. And again, Nicole gave a really good example of that you go out and you may see 40 trees and you're thinking, oh, hopefully this isn't going to grow. And then you go back and it's 1,000 dead trees. And that's what was typical for us on Long Island early on, where, you know, we saw some infestations grow to, you know, well over 1,000 trees. It's closer to 2,000 at times. It does form infestations. We refer to those as spots. And the beetles sort of stay in those areas, generally speaking, once the infestations are growing. And it has a really well-developed pheromone system. And why that's important for management is really it's key to, number one, you know, you've seen monitoring, but also our attempts to disrupt that and what that means to infestation spreading or initiating in a forest. And then there's always a lot of discussion about Southern Pine Beetle dispersal. It's really, it's an insect that has never been demonstrated to go towards stressed trees. You hear that a fair bit with bark beetles, and probably 95% of the bark beetles out there go to, you know, a stressed tree, but that we've never been able to show that for Southern Pine Beetle. And so it's out there just kind of randomly attacking trees and trying to form, you know, or mass attack those trees and form infestations. And this is important when we talk about treatments, that, you know, even if you thin a stand, you may still get Southern Pine Beetle attack trees, but you shouldn't have an infestation form. So the expectation of completely 100% protecting the stand is unrealistic. Dispersal really helps us understanding this, because, you know, in the spring we expect long distance dispersal where the insects are, you know, going out and looking for host trees to then form that mass attack. But in the summer, the behavior of the beetle changes in the way that it responds to the pheromone, but also there's just not a lot of long range dispersal going on with those generations coming out. They're predisposed to stay sort of local, for lack of a better way to put it. And then host defenses, right? No tree is immune, so you can have the healthiest tree possible on the environment, and it maybe would win against, moderate to high populations of southern pine beetle. But once populations get really big, any tree can be overtaken by mass attack by southern pine beetle. And so I think, several of us have referenced different parts of the management for southern pine beetle, and we've lifted this really directly from the Southeast and their efforts there. We were fortunate to work with some great entomologists from down there that had, decades of experience. And so, we touched on detection, monitor, trapping. That's an important component of it. But for today, or for the rest of my time here, I'm going to touch on spot disruption, which is what we normally just refer to as suppression, but it really is disrupting the infestation. And then where like the big money is for us, I think, and benefits is preventative silvicultural treatments. And it's great that so much of this effort has already been put out there on the landscape. People have been restoring pitch pine for decades, trying to get stands back into, kind of a perceived natural condition. And that really helps with lowering risk or hazard to southern pine beetle. And so disruption of current infestations it's not focused on beetle mortality. And this came up with some of what Nicole was talking about, that, you're putting all of these trees on the ground, but you're not necessarily killing any of those beetles. I mean, some portion of them are dying, but in the Southeast, you're only looking at, 10 or 15% of the brood in those trees being killed during the suppression. So it's really focused on and I'll show a figure of this in a second, but it's really focused on disrupting that active pheromone plume. So when those beetles in the down trees come out and disperse, they can't cue in on a pheromone, so they just disperse out through the environment. So those emerging SPB disperse. And then the really nice thing, at least from the Southeast, is, there's no evidence of that disruption increases spot. So when you go in and disrupt a spot, you're not necessarily proliferating adjacent infestations. But I think, again, this is a situation where that's a tool developed in the Southeast with a large pine resource. And in our habitats up here, our landscapes and the way that our forests are, it seems likely to me that even dispersing beetles may end up coming back around to a pine stand because they are more isolated on the landscape. So we don't know for sure, exactly how effective some of these things are here. We see some success, and then we see a lot of situations where infestations continue to grow. And this is just, the sort of this typical diagram of the two techniques, cut and leave and cut and remove. This is in our NAFC document, but I just copied it, changed things up a little bit from the Southeast. And just really quickly, you've got an infestation, you've got the black trees here are vacated trees. So southern pine beetle has left them, but there's still good insects in there. Some of the predators, the parasitoids, competitors. The yellow trees are all of the infested trees. And then you have this, what we refer to as a green tree buffer. And so some of the trees in the buffer may be lightly attacked. So they could be a source of pheromones. And so it's a pretty conservative way of trying to knock back and eliminate any resource of pheromone out there by cutting those two. And that distance is the green tree buffer distance is often one tree length, so not a lot of thought has gone into that. And I think Nicole touched on the difficulty of sort of getting all of these trees down on the ground nice and neat and put back on themselves. And that's the approach generally, is to fell the trees back towards where the spot initiated. But again, this is based on southern experience, and in the South you generally have a front where the infestation is growing, sometimes maybe two fronts, but we don't really see, I mean, we see that, but I think to me, the general pattern of the infestations I've been in is that they just sort of grow out. There's not really a front, it's just kind of spreading in all different directions, and that makes managing it a little bit more difficult. Cut and remove is the same same deal, except all that wood's being removed and processed off site. And so we haven't really been able to do this, right? I think, Nicole touched on this, Jess is going to touch on this, I'm sure, with, the realities on Long Island and then on the Massachusetts islands. It's like, you're not able to economically, it's not economically feasible to pull that material out of the forest. And so there's a lot of considerations with disrupting infestations, and the first one, really the most important, probably is the infestation size. And I think sometimes early on we may have gone at larger infestations that didn't really fit the prescription, but really kind of the sweet spot is 20 trees or more. The hope is that infestations that have like 10 or 15 trees just die out. When you get to 20 to like 50, maybe 100 trees, you can still try to suppress that. But once you're beyond 100, that's just too much of an effort. When you start adding in green tree buffers and all of that, it's a lot of material that's got to come down. But you also have to really consider the potential for growth. How much pine is in that area? What is the hazard of that stand? Or how susceptible are those pine trees if there's room for growth of the infestation? And season's a big one for us. And I don't know that we have a great handle on this yet, even after, 10 years of working on it, that, in the South, the infestations sort of shut down, and they shut down on Long Island, and I'm sure it's the same in Massachusetts. But things seem to go longer. And so I know I've been out in November and December, and there's been active infestations. And then I think even in January, we've seen what I think were freshly attacked trees from probably just a week or two before that. So, but as the season goes on, the chance of disrupting the infestation is less likely because the beetles are slowing down and cutting trees that may not really be a source of attraction, especially that green tree buffer. Stand isolation is important. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then, local markets, which we haven't had to worry about because there have been none, but that may be a consideration moving forward. It certainly is a consideration when you start to think about preventative thinnings. And, the isolation, it's just something I think I've been thinking about more in the landscape. And you look at, like the SPB pine barrens, Waterboro, Albany pine bush. So holdings that are, 2,500 acres or more. And if you found an infestation in, Albany or in Ossipee, in June or July, you really would want to be pretty aggressive at trying to knock that back and getting, knocking back sort of a foothold of the beetle if that all works out that way. Where, as in some of the more isolated small stands, you're really going to have to think through the options and what the best treatment there would be, if any. Okay, and then so just, we've been, Polly mentioned this, that we've been really focusing on reducing susceptibility in pine stands. And I say we, as like, I mean, I'm new to this, relatively speaking, to, all of the folks who've been around doing, prescribed fire in these stands, thinking about ways to open them up and get them back into sort of this, more natural condition. And it's just been, I've learned a lot from all these people, so that's been great. But it's also just one of these unique times where, you can layer one objective over the other and they work perfectly together. And so anything you would do to, restore a pitch pine stand would benefit that in reducing its susceptibility to southern pine beetle as well. And it really comes down to, unmanaged pitch pine is great southern pine beetle habitat. And so if you think about these closed canopies, they restrict air movement. You're not getting pheromones sort of pulled up through like a chimney effect and dispersed that way. And even under the canopy there, the pheromone plumes are pretty stable. And so beetles are able to follow those sort of upwind. And then, these stands have high stem density, and so therefore the trees are close together. So it's really easy for an infestation to grow in that. And so beetles emerging from one generation to the next are easily able to find an adjacent tree and initiate attack on that. And in general, we think of, high hazard or highly susceptible stands as having basal areas over 100 square feet an acre. 120, 140, 160 even is not uncommon, and some of those stands have fairly large pitch pine as well that are really good habitat for southern pine beetle once they kill the tree. Now, compared to that, managed pitch pine is really poor southern pine beetle habitat, and this is some of the work at Waterboro pine barrens from just this past spring, and you can see how open the canopy is. You can easily envision on a warm day, the plume of pheromones getting pulled upward and out of that stand and disrupting southern pine beetle's ability to find their next tree. It's an environment that's very hostile with pheromones. So even if it's not getting pulled out, there's these large inter-tree distances. So beetles coming out are going to have a hard time tracking pheromones to the next source. So again, you may have a random, attack in here, one or two trees, and we've seen that in some treatments, but we have yet to see infestations grow. So you could get a tree killed, but not, you should not see, or we do not expect to see growth in these. And so low susceptibility hazard for infestations, but it's still possible to get attacked trees. And just to reiterate, I mean, there's there's really two mechanisms at play here, and the big one is disrupting that pheromone and moving, the stand on the left towards something like what is on the right. And I think both of these pictures are from our demo forest at Rocky Point, where this was our typical kind of conditions of Long Island pitch pine barrens, and this is the initial stages of opening up those stands, and consequently allowing for disruption of pheromones. Kind of an odd, it's not an odd, but a side effect, again, it's not the target of the treatment, but there is an additional benefit as, generally speaking, when you thin a stand, you improve health of the trees. For pines, that generally means that you've increased resin defenses, but not always. But I think it's a safe assumption to think that the health of those trees has resulted in stronger resin defenses in the residual trees, and therefore they're better able to fight off beetles, certainly fight off low populations, maybe have a chance against moderate populations, and then have a tough time of it against high populations. But so that's a side benefit of those thinnings. Okay, so just to summarize, southern pine beetle will be a consistent threat to unmanaged pitch pine. New York's been dealing with this really for 10 years, nonstop. They stood up a program in 2014, hired a lot of people. There's been an effort, that whole time to get southern pine beetle under control there, and it's just always going to be out there causing problems as long as there's habitat. Spot disruption should not be, the primary management method. And again, I'm just pointing back to Nicole's presentation that there's always going to be this balance of like, man, should we, do we have a chance with this? Is this in a campground? Is there going to be problems with, putting this much fuel on the ground? What are the long-term implications? If you're trying to maintain pitch pine, and you go in and do a spot disruption, does that mean that you're going to have to go back in and do aggressive restoration as well? And so a lot of things come into play, and I think it all leads to, the best approach, which again, people have been putting out on the landscape for decades, is restoring and opening up these pitch pine stands and making them hostile environments. And so southern pine beetle exploits that available habitat. It's a beetle doing beetle things, right? Like it's just doing what it does, and it's really, really good at it. It's a very effective tree killer. But fortunately, those habitats can be manipulated. We know that, there's long-standing and tested restoration efforts, and again, those align with southern pine beetle prevention. So I think we're in a really good place if we can get ahead of southern pine beetle, and we're starting to see that more and more with some of the more isolated pitch pine areas. Certainly Albany Pine Bush has been restoring and managing stands for a long time, but we see that now in Waterboro and Maine and Ossipee as well, where both those areas had some level of restoration going on. But I think they've been able to use Southern Pine Beetle in the way of like, we got to get on this now and get some funding and get more concerned there. So I think that's it. I just wanted to leave you with a few pictures of all the awesome efforts that have been ongoing in the area. Milestone just looks great. Brookhaven has some amazing treatments in. Waterboro looks awesome. If you haven't made it to any of these areas, you can. I suggest it. And then that's our Rocky Point demo forest on the right. So that is it for me. I'll stop the share, and I think we're going to Justin next.
Yeah, that is right. Let's see here. Let me know when you can see that.
Up now, you're up.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Good.
All right. So, as Alana had mentioned earlier, one of the key questions that we're trying to answer is, where are the pitch pine? Without knowing where they are, it's kind of hard to do any proactive management. So Alana pulled me in on this project. And so we are trying to use some satellite imagery to figure out where the pitch pine are in the state of Rhode Island. On this title slide, the map here on the right, I've got a small section of Rhode Island, and this shows some of the available data sets that we have. The yellow polygons are the Rhode Island Ecological Communities Map, which was produced by a contractor working with the state of Rhode Island. And then the Forest Service has a few layers in here. The green is our species parameter maps. The larger purple pixels are from the Northern Insect and Disease Risk Map from 2012. And then the orange pixels are from Landfire, which is a Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture collaboration. And then these red triangles here are some areas that we visited on the ground that have pitch pine, but that aren't represented by these available data products. And so if a key part of management is knowing where the resource is, then we need a better map that shows maybe some of these rare habitats where we can find pitch pine across the landscape. And so this scenario that you're seeing right here in this small section of Rhode Island plays out across the state, particularly in the northern areas of the state where very little pitch pine is mapped by these available products. And so we are trying to produce something better. So individual species mapping, many folks in the remote sensing world will tell you this is the holy grail. It's hard to get to. There are similarities in spectral signatures between individuals of the same species, dissimilarities in spectral signatures between individuals of different species. There's a lot of words up here. Long story short, it's complicated, it's difficult, and our expectations need to be tailored and need to be considerate of the complexity of individual species mapping. And just to kind of like dig into one little aspect of this, we'll talk about spatial resolution of the data that we used here. So high resolution or very high resolution data, such as from the Northern Agriculture Imagery Program, which is at anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6 meters in spatial resolution, high amount of detail. You can see individual crowns, you can see dead branches, you can see gaps between the crowns. But as our resolution gets lower towards the right, you can see that the waters start to get a little bit muddy. We lose those individual crowns, we lose the gaps, we lose the dead branches, and we lose, the individual crown spectral signature. So it would be great if we could use this high resolution data to map a tree species across the landscape, but that takes a lot of computing power that most of us don't have at our disposal. So typically these efforts rely on moderate spatial resolution data, and in this project we're going to use Sentinel-2. So a little bit more about this. There are many different ways to try to crack this nut. Some folks rely on fundamental niche modeling or habitat suitability modeling, where you rely on environmental variables such as climate, topography, and soils, presence and absence of the species that you're trying to model. And in the end, this will tell you where you might expect to find a species. Realized niche modeling, they start to work in remotely sensed imagery, and this with also some of the climate, topography, and soils variables. And this kind of gets you closer to where you're going to find it currently. And then image classification, this will get you to where you find it currently, but is a little bit harder to do, as I said, because you have these similarities between species, especially like in this case, between pitch pine and white pine. So for this effort, we are relying on this realized niche model. So we're going to work in some soils and elevation data. We have the Sentinel-2 imagery, which is at 10-meter spatial resolution. And we're going to do this in a random forest modeling framework. There are other modeling frameworks such as maximum entropy or artificial intelligence, but we're going to work with random forest because it's robust to overfitting. It deals well with the multicollinearity between the predictor variables, and just does a great job of uncovering relationships in the data. So here is our approach. Over here on the left, I have a list of all the data sources that we used, and we're doing all this within the Google Earth Engine environment. Google Earth Engine has a great catalog of data that's available, and it's all cloud-based computing environments, so it doesn't tax the local computer, the local system. You just have to know how to code and be able to get into this environment and do the work. So Sentinel-2 imagery, we used a spring, April 15th to May 15th. So this is right around the time where buds are breaking and leaves are starting to expand, but we're still able to get the greenness from the conifer component. And so there are 12 optical bands in Sentinel-2 imagery, and then we used all sorts of combinations of these bands to produce vegetation indices and principal components. And then also in the awesome GEE catalog, GEE is Google Earth Engine, we have soil texture such as percent clay, percent sand, and percent silt, as well as soil pH. And then also terrain variables, elevation, slope, aspect. So we aggregated all of these within Google Earth Engine over multiple ground visits. We got about 72 presence areas for pitch pine, and then developed a data set of absence points. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So as I mentioned, we visited 72 pitch pine stands on the ground. But because we're classifying an entire Sentinel-2 data set that covers the whole state of Rhode Island, because we want to find all these rare or core pitch pine areas too, the absence data needs to reflect the variability of the imagery across the landscape. So what we did is I took the National Land Cover data set, which is in this image on the right, and equally distributed absence points amongst all the classes in the national land cover data set. And so that gives us the variability that we need in order to really develop a strong classification for where we're not going to find pitch pine. And then for the areas where there is going to be pitch pine, we need to somehow try to separate pitch pine from white pine in these areas. And that's the tricky part to do. And so we had the 72 areas that we went to on the ground where there definitely was pitch pine. And we were able to, using that data and some photo interpretation, find areas where there was no pitch pine and it was just white pine. And so that kind of is the area in the imagery where we're really trying to separate and pull out this individual species classification. And as is typical for a modeling effort like this, although we have all these training data points, we want to reserve some of those for validation of the model in the end to see how well we did. So we're going to go through it piece by piece. So I've already gone through the predictor variable and data aggregation. So now we're going to go to the predictor variable selection. So in all, we started with 30 variables. Not all of those are going to be in the final model. So we want to go through and pick out the ones that are going to do the best. So using an iterative random forest classification, in each successive model, we pick out the least important predictor variable for that model. And so then we just sort of refine it as we go down through those models. And in the end, we also use a little bit of expert knowledge intervention. Sometimes, going through, it does find relationships in the data, but then when you go to actually apply the model across the landscape, maybe it's missing some areas that you think should be in there. And so then you can refine the variables that you keep in the model from there. So I skipped over number 3. That's probably just a little bit beyond what we need to know for this presentation, but basically the model does a little bit of self-optimizing for the number of trees and out of bag air estimate and other things that we could talk about at another time. But in the end, we get to the evaluate and repeat stage. So that way we can just kind of look to see how things apply across the landscape, make any changes that we need to, and continually refine the model. So here are the results from the most recent and most successful model. So the overall accuracy is coming in at about 85%. And the user's accuracy for the present class, which is where we would find pitch pine or where we did find pitch pine on the ground, is about 73%. The F1 statistic here is 0.83. This F1 statistic is essentially a combination of these different user accuracies and the overall accuracy. And so it gives us a more holistic measure of how accurate the product is. And it comes in at 0.83. If I had to guess, I would say the actual accuracy is somewhere between 70 and 80%, just based on what I'm seeing as I'm panning around and looking at the actual output from the model. So here's a look at the predictor variables that ended up staying in the model. Most of them are vegetation indices, although we do have some soil and elevation component in the model, but it really relied heavily on the optical data from the Sentinel-2, which is good because that definitely gets us out to more of the where is it at currently that we are looking for. And so in the end, kind of bringing it full circle back to where we started, where we were looking at the different data sources that were already available. We want to compare this to that. Now, we can't do a full accuracy assessment on these other data sources that we have because that would basically be unfair. Those other modeling or those other data products that are available were had under different modeling frameworks, there are different spatial resolutions. There's a lot of differences between what they did and what we did. And so it'd just be kind of unfair, but we can look at the utility of these layers and trying to find pitch pine areas across the landscape. And so we looked at our 72 total presence points in the ground data. So how many of these were actually captured by these available pitch pine data sets? And so you can see the list here. Landfire, we only captured 13% of them. The Rhode Island ecological communities only captured 18%. NIDRIM 40% about, and the FHP species parameter map, 47% was actually quite good. And so here's a quick two maps to kind of compare the products. So this map here on the left are the available data products. The ecological communities are these gray polygons. Dark purple is the FHP species parameter map for pitch pine. The lighter purple, the larger pixels, is the Northern Insect and Disease Risk Map. And then this mossy green color is the landfire. So as you saw before, there's some good overlap between these different layers, but we're missing some of the pitch pine out here on the edge of this area. And so the most recent classification using the Sentinel-2 data, we definitely start to pick up a lot more of the pitch pine in this area to the right. And there's good overlap between what has been predicted by some of these other data sets. And so that's good. So overall, that's kind of where we're at. The data is still preliminary. We're still working on refining and repeating. Hopefully, you're going to try to work in some other data sources such as LiDAR, because there is confusion still between white pine and pitch pine in some areas. And so we want to try to see if we can refine that and bring that in a little bit and before we have a final product. Also, analysis of predictor variable importance. So we want to dig a little bit deeper to see why certain components of the optical or the landscape data is coming up as important, and kind of get an idea of how the model is seeing the relationships in these data. And then in the end, trying to get at what Alex mentioned earlier, which is how much risk is within these stands based on the basal area that's there and the soil texture and so on. So future steps for this, going to get at that predictive basal area model for some of these core pitch pine areas. And so LiDAR was collected over the state of Rhode Island just a couple of years ago. And so hopefully sometime in the next year or so, we'll get some more plot data and be able to model out pitch pine in these areas and apply those models across the landscape. And that is it for me. I just want to say thank you to Alana for pulling me in on this project, and to Donna and Jordan, who helped out a lot with the ground verification of the pitch pine areas. Thank you. I think I pass it on to Jess now.
Okay. Can everyone see my presentation?
I think it's coming up. There you go.
There it is.
You're not in full screen yet, but
Oh, right. Okay.
you have 4 minutes.
I know, right? Well, luckily I talk fast. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just stick with me. We've got a little longer to go, and I'll try to be quick. I'm going to talk today about our forest management on Long Island. So, as has been covered already, most of the management and the Southern Pine Beetle response in general has been restricted to the central pine barrens of Long Island, where there is, 100,000 acres of contiguous forest that makes up the preserve. There's a lot of partners within the Central Pine Barrens, and I've just showed some of them at the bottom. Some of these are land managers, land owners within the Pine Barrens, but also we have like the Forest Service on here, who has just been present on Long Island through the years, offering funding and technical assistance and doing research. So it's been a real big effort from a lot of different people. And initially, to some degree, we all worked together during the initial response in 2014. We had an incident command system set up with representatives from most of these partners. And over the years, a lot of that has been maintained. To this day, at least in DEC, we still maintain sort of like a modified incident command structure that has most of these partners on still. So most of all, I think we've just been learning from each other this whole time and figuring things out together. So in 2014, Long Island got hit really hard. Our first aerial survey showed about 10,000 acres of damage on the ground. There was just mass mortality, tens of thousands of trees. And you can see on the figure on the left that it looks like our that 9,000 acres of damage map in 2014 was in the fall when we first found it. And then when we got our first aerial survey done in January, or our next aerial survey, it was about 35,000 acres. Over the years, however, we have seen a decline in the damage caused by Southern Pine Beetle. And that can be, for a variety of complex factors that I don't fully understand. It could be partially our management. It could be that it's taken out a lot of pitch pine already, and some areas have been, quite thinned. Or it could be natural enemies. When it first arrived, there was a lack of natural enemies. It hit so hard, there was that lag, and we were finding infested trees with like really virtually no sign of natural enemies. So, there's climatic factors and so on. So, we often, I'll show you in this next map, just typically what it kind of looks like on Long Island. And I use these last couple of years of damage because we're still processing our 2025 aerial survey, but it's sort of peppered across the landscape. And you have areas that are really bad in one year, like where you see the red, but then you have green areas. So it might feel really bad if you're in Napeague, but if you're out in East Hampton, maybe it's a decent year, so the response varies across the landscape on Long Island because like it's been ramping up on the South Fork of Long Island recently. So we get a lot of calls of people that are very concerned and upset, while it's kind of off the radar of some of the people to the west that haven't dealt with, severe outbreaks in a while. So since 2014, for many years, we primarily utilized cut and leave suppression for our management. And that was a result of just being reactive. First of all, it hit fast and we had to do something. And that was the tool that we had. There was a lot of management challenges on Long Island. We had no timber markets whatsoever. No one wanted the pitch pine. So we couldn't offset the costs of management. And these numbers have changed, I'm sure. But back when, we were looking down south where in the Southern Pine plantations, they could manage Southern Pine Beetle for like $200 an acre. But on Long Island, we were spending at least $2,000 to $5,000 an acre to manage, given there was no timber market. It's a highly populated area. There's tons of different land ownerships. There's a lot of, wildland urban interface. And there's no history of forest management, no recent history. So as Polly kind of described earlier. So using cut and leave, we cut down a lot of trees, and that has had an impact combined with mortality caused by Southern Pine Beetle directly. In a lot of our areas, we have lost the pitch pine component completely, or it's been severely reduced. And there has been some research on that. I didn't show the paper in this presentation, but like Kevin Dodds and Molly Heiss and Tony D'Amato, our partners, have actually characterized that to some extent, the loss of that pitch pine. So as the years went by and we slowly, we're in the state, so everything moves at glacial speed. As we develop more mechanisms to do a more diverse work, we did not want to rely on suppression any longer. And we thought that like a more, broad ecosystem level approach would be better. And there was a couple things driving that. Like I said, we just had some momentum. We were able to put, MOUs and contracts and things in place to get more work done. But also, the northern long-eared bat was listed at one point, which, as Nicole mentioned earlier, really limited our capacity to do suppression in the summertime. And of course, the central pine barrens were becoming hardwood dominant, and we really wanted to maintain the pine barrens and do what we could to contribute to that over time. We want to maintain the dominance of pitch pine. And so we really wanted to assist in bringing the barrens back to their natural state and introducing some sort of fire regime. So we talk a lot about current forest conditions on Long Island, and Polly covered this already, and I'm glad Kevin covered the pheromones. Now I don't have to explain it. But on Long Island, here's another picture, high density forests. These were highly susceptible to southern pine beetle when it arrived and subsequently caused a lot of damage. So obviously our desired future condition is to open up those forests and allow more light and air into the stands, allow for some regeneration capacity, and of course that all serves to mitigate southern pine beetle as well. They are not as effective communicators with each other when there's an open stand and the pheromones don't persist. So, in addition, our desired future conditions, were generally to, reduce basal area. The guidelines for southern pine beetle are about, I think, 80 square feet, 60 to 80 square feet. In a lot of areas, we like to try to go down much lower because, again, we're managing for a pine barrens. So we might go down to 30 or 40 square feet. We want to increase biodiversity. We want to bring back some of the plant and wildlife associations within the Pine Barrens that have been lost due to closed canopy forests. And of course, we want to reduce fuel load and wildfire risk. So on Long Island, this wildland urban interface exists everywhere. It's a unique system to do forest management because of it. And so what you're looking at now is Sarnoff State Forest, where I'm going to highlight some of the forest management we do in a moment. And you can see the town of Riverhead is directly north. And so you can just see how these high wildfire risk forests are butting right up against well-populated areas. And historically, fire has moved from the southwest to the northeast. So in the case of Sarnoff State Forest, if there were a wildfire to break out, it would move right towards Riverhead. So one of our first priorities was trying to mitigate some of that. So just as an aside, as part of the strategy to have like a more ecosystem level approach to Long Island, we worked with the Pine Barrens Commission over the last several years to try to build a prescribed fire program. And Polly's in this picture we've heard from today. She was in that position prior to being with the Guild. And she has devoted so much time and energy and sweat and tears and all of those things to building this program because it's no small feat. And there's been a lot of challenges associated with that. So it's one thing to say, yeah, we need more fire on the ground, right? But again, we're dealing with a system where there's a lot of limitations standing in our way. And to this day, we're not quite there, but we're getting there slowly. Uh, they do a lot of grassland burning on Long Island, but we haven't quite been able to get the forested burning done as much as we'd like to. So we're averaging, maybe 30 acres a year, where we want to be doing at least 500. Polly has written burn plans that'll probably last us for the next like many decades. So we're ready to go, but we just don't quite have the capacity that we need. And so it's something that we continue to work on. And when you talk to the Albany Pine Bush, they say, be patient. It took us 20 years to build this. So we're trying to be patient. So this is Sarnoff State Forest again. And so again, while we wait for the burning, there's a lot of other work to be done. And some of you in the chat brought up like fuels management and controlling the woody debris prior to burning. And so that's certainly been one of our focus areas. So this shows all the different stands. I'll also just say quickly that when we started managing on Long Island, there was no forest inventory. The stand delineations were really outdated. So as part of our work over the years, we've had to sort of like remap our state forests and create new stands that are like more relevant to current conditions and do those inventories. And we have started thinning. I think like all the stands except for the ones in gray have been thinned to date. We tried to start with the highest priority ones that, were either near a road or near Riverhead, or were just like really high density and high southern pine beetle susceptibility. So we do a few different things. a big one obviously is stand thinning. So I talked about our target basal area of 60 to 80 square feet, sometimes less. This just shows a photo of that at Sarnoff. And these aren't like two photos next to each other. It's literally one picture where we just hadn't yet gotten to the other stands. You can see on the left where we've thinned and on the right where we have not yet thinned. The other thing we do is we treat the understory with our forestry mower. We mostly just use the forestry mower to clear out scrub oak. Although scrub oak is like a dominant species in pine barrens ecosystems, a lot of the scrub oak in these stands had become quite unruly and just old and woody and dense and out of control. And then in a lot of stands, we also have a lot of invasive plants. We do use herbicide on the invasives when needed, but again, most of the work is done with the forestry mower. So we clear the understory first. And then we also have other wildfire risk reduction activities, mostly concerning ladder fuels. So in areas where we thinned, again, we can't get rid of the pitch pine, right? So when we do thinning to preventatively manage for southern pine beetle, those trees stay on the ground. Again, it's like essentially kind of like a version of cutting leaves. So sometimes they are bucked up or some of them are chipped, but it still leaves a lot of woody material on the ground. And then on the other side of that, in areas with active infestations where cut and leave has been utilized, there's also a lot of wood on the ground. So standing dead trees that have been killed from southern pine beetle can create ladder fuels. Woody debris on the ground can create ladder fuels, but also just live trees in high density areas can create ladder fuels. So again, our goal is to thin, open up the space a little bit, and then we do, like I said, the understory treatments, but we also do pile burning, which I think you can see a couple of photos of down below. So prior to any prescribed fire, all of these things are happening. And the pile burning is done kind of throughout the year, I think, but we have to use the forest rangers to do it. We can't quite do it on our own. So while it's a relatively easy activity to get done, we're still like reliant on the forest rangers being present to oversee that work. This is just kind of a summary of everything I just talked about. The work involves a combination of marking for subsequent thinning, slash and fuel management, and then eventually prescribed fire. On the upper left-hand corner, though, you can see that in terms of wildfire risk reduction, we've had to do some other activities like opening up access roads in the state forest to make sure that they're wide enough. It not only creates fire breaks in the case of a wildfire, but it allows fire trucks to get in there if there is an emergency response required. A lot of these roads were really like grown over and non-accessible. And this year we're actually experimenting with an air curtain burner to try to mitigate fuels on the ground. And this actually isn't the photo of the air curtain burner we got. I just couldn't find one. We actually got like a mobile device that can be moved around to various locations. So if you're not familiar with an air curtain burner, it's a device that's used to burn wood debris and other organic waste efficiently and with minimal smoke using a high velocity curtain of air. And so Rob Cole, who manages our restoration program on Long Island, is working with SUNY ESF. And I think they're actually doing some research into this. So we're going to be using it operationally, but he's also going to be looking at air emissions and comparing the air curtain burner operation to pile burning, biochar, and other methods. I just want to talk about NAPI real quick. I know we have some state park staff on the call, and this is just an interesting situation that represents a lot in terms of the SPB struggle, because NAPI is a 1,400 acre state park that is home to all kinds of like unique ecological communities that was just ravaged by southern pine beetle, I don't know, a couple of years ago. And you can see in the photo on the right this highway, and this is a highway that connects like mainland Long Island to the South Fork, and it's like a narrow strip of land. And so there's like 500 acres of dead pitch pine all along the road. And so obviously people are really concerned. Like if a wildfire breaks out there, that people can get trapped. I mean, if you head this way during like rush hour, it's just like nonstop, like congested traffic the whole way. So it could be a really dangerous situation if something broke out. I mean, the good thing about it is it's so visible and so next to the road that it's like really invoked a lot of conversation more recently on Long Island that I think, you know, we hadn't gotten that much press in a while or that much concern about all the associated risks. So it's good to see those conversations being had. And State Parks is doing a lot of work. And it also represents for them the first time that they've ever really done like preventative forest management in state parks. So that's kind of created this whole nother level of work and, you know, formal agreements and things to do that. So it's kind of a historic shift, which, as Polly talked about the benefits of Southern Pine Beetle earlier, I would argue this is one, is that it's forcing land managers to start thinking about preventative management that have never really thought about it before. And we're all kind of in that boat to some degree. And so they did some thinning, but they've also been doing these enormous fire breaks, which look really nice because, again, it's butted right up against neighborhoods. So you can see the picture on the right, the fire break that they installed. There's just a suburban neighborhood just like within feet. So it's like really important that, you know, they get these installed to protect neighboring communities. And so it's just been interesting. So we've talked a little bit about wildfire, but you know we're pretty excited about the ecosystem benefits of prescribed fire on Long Island and thinning to some degree. Um, and I just wanted to highlight some of the work of Amanda Dillon, she goes by Dillon, who's our research lab manager. She's been monitoring native bee communities in our burned areas. Um, and, you know, ground nesting, pollinating bees are really common or were common in the Pine Barrens, many native species. It creates perfect habitat for ground nesting bees. And I think, you know, their populations have been declining along with Pine Barrens habitat. So a lot of people, you know, the public reaches out a lot, you know, with concerns about prescribed fire and, you know, are you killing wildlife or what's happening to everything that lives there, right? So we like to use this as an example of not only an increase in biodiversity as a result of prescribed fire, but also showing how resilient some of these species are. So we notice, I can't remember what the species of bee was, but it popped up like a day or two after we had a prescribed fire, which showed that it was just like burrowing a few inches, you know, below the ground, and it was just fine. It hid, and then it came out when the fire was over. And her monitoring has showed just how well these bees are responding to prescribed fire. On the left is a petri dish full of some monitoring traps in the burned unit, and on the right are the monitoring traps from the unburned unit. We also have, you know, this whole suite of moths and other arthropods associated with the Pine Barrens that have, they're, you know, either rare or of conservation concern in many states. And so they feed off of scrub oak primarily, which you would say, well, we have a ton of scrub oak on Long Island. What's the big deal? But like I said before, we have like woody, old, thick, you know, leathery leaved scrub oak. And what these moths really need is new growth. They need young, regenerating scrub oak. And so the fire provides that. And so we haven't yet like started formally monitoring these, but just observationally, we've seen an increase in some of these species at our sites as well. Oh, somehow that slide got in there twice. Let me just skip past. And I think that's all I have. That was quick, right?
Just like 4 minutes. It was perfect.
All right. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat. And I also just want to say that as follow-up, like Rob Cole, like I said, with DEC is the one that kind of heads this project. So if you have follow-up questions, he's a good person to contact as well.
Thank you, Jess. I'm assuming you're able to hear me.
Yes.
May have resolved the technical issues. I'm not sure. So, but thank you, Jess and Kevin and Justin, Nicole and Alex, all for your contributions to this afternoon, or the second component of our workshop. It is 12:18. Some of us ran a little late, including myself, which I fully own. Apologies for that. But we do have time to ask questions, and I don't know if there's any other questions that have been put out. Kevin, that the only question I can see, because I got booted, was the question from Maggie about air curtain burners. But if you're interested in asking a question, you can raise your hand and unmute and answer that question, or you can put it in the chat.
I put it in the chat, but it was Andy Vandriot at ESF, which I think a lot of people know him. It's the region.
Any questions for any of our speakers throughout the day? Comments or reflections?
I think we got all the questions in the chat. If there was anything missed, I think this would be a good time to bring it up. It's hard to track it sometimes. We have a new addition to the chat.
You have a new addition.
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
Coming in and out of the blur.
An avid Southern Pine Beetle detector. So, all right, last call for questions.
Thanks everybody for joining. It was great having this many people and seeing a lot of folks that have been involved in a lot of this work, and then a bunch of, at least to me, new names as well.
So Becky,
you got it. You got it, Polly. All right, cool. You said.
Sorry, Becky Sibner asked, does anyone have thoughts about how fire history may vary between the areas like the Central Pine Barrens versus the coastal areas like the South Fork of Long Island or Martha's Vineyard? So I try to tackle that. The fire return intervals in the fire history will definitely vary between these areas as far as the occurrence and the alignment of conditions that allow for fire to occur. The fire return intervals are really based upon the predominance of the current ecosystem, and so that would be the ideal ecological return of when recruitment and regeneration of fuels advances to the point that fire could be carried readily through that landscape. And that varies with the dwarf pine barrens between 6 and 20 years with their fire return interval, upwards to the pitch pine pine oak of 40 years. So many of the fire return intervals have been exceeded in the coastal plain areas because fire hasn't been returned to the landscape due to wildfire suppression. As far as fire history, I'm not as familiar with comparing and contrasting the wildfire history between the two areas. But I know in an analysis that Bob Pankow did on Long Island is that since 1930, there's been less and less large wildfires that have occurred in the region in Long Island, and those are fires over 100 acres in size. So I don't know if Dave Crary or Karen has anything further, or Jake, to add to that response. No. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I didn't see the total numbers of people, but I know we had upwards of 80 people registered and people bopping in and out. I think at most I saw 50 people on at one time, so that's a great number. Thank you to all of our presenters and the working group, and for Kevin for initiating, organizing this workshop. As shared before, we will be posting that on our website and sending it out to all the attendees in case there's anything that you'd like to revisit, and we'll also have the links available to the resources that were mentioned. So thank you very much, and hope everyone has a good rest of your afternoon.